to the cloud. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those overseas, and so on and so forth. So welcome to this second lecture of our Module 9 on regulation of network industries. So today we have the honor to welcome Professor Alexandre de Streel, who is Academic Director at CER and Professor of Law, of European Law at the University of Namur in Belgium, and the Research Center for Information, Law and Society since April 2021. So happy birthday for that. He is also the chair of the EU Observatory on Online Platform Economy. He is at the moment Hauser Global Fellow at NYU in New York City for the law school. And I will let Alex, of course, explain a bit more of his background to you. So please welcome Alex, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valérie. Thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. So I am sorry not to be with you, but as Valérie was just explaining, I am in the US this year for a sabbatical year where I try to understand what is the US strategy with big tech, because I have worked on telecom regulation, and I'm still working on telecom regulation and antitrust in telecom. But I also do the same as many people in digital now, and so this is why I am in the US and not with you, unfortunately. And so the goal of this module is really, as you know, the module is dealing with antitrust and regulation in network industries. And so what we have decided among the group of teachers is to divide according to our, let's say, comparative advantage. So some are talking about energy, railways, and I am talking about telecommunication. Okay, and so really the idea of this part of the module of today session is to focus on the application of antitrust and regulation in ex-ante regulation in the telecom sector, and as the other module, we will mostly focus on EU law. Okay, so what I will do, what I suggest to do, because we are doing that with Zoom, which has its pros and cons, but is to do maybe a very small break after 1 hour, because I have realized that it's more complicated to keep attention on Zoom than on others than in physically, and then maybe a longer break after the 2nd hour, and then again a short break after the 3rd hour, and that would lead us to the end. I have a set of slides that I will present, and that I guess you have, and then also a set of background reading. So the idea was, of course, not that you read it beforehand, but it is just if you want to go further in what I will explain to you, and I will try to refer to those readings as I go along the presentation. And so really it's for you as a background information if you are interested in a specific question or too deep a specific issue. Okay, so maybe but I can ask you, I would like to ask you first if some of you have or are already have in the past or are currently working on antitrust and or regulation in the telecommunication sector, or what we call in Europe the electronic communication sector. I don't know if some of you have experience there or not.
Yes, I do. My name's Sonia. I'm currently located in Italy where I'm working, but for the last 20 years I've worked in telecommunications and antitrust. Okay. But not in a European context. I'm an Australian qualified lawyer, and I've worked in Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. But I don't do a lot of telco in Europe. I do more general antitrust work.
And you were in a law firm in Australia, or you were in a company?
Yeah, I started off in a big international law firm, and then I worked for international telecommunications companies in-house, leading the antitrust division.
Ah, great. Okay, so please.
So I'm very interested.
Share your experience, but also share your experience with us.
Okay.
Don't hesitate to jump in and says, okay, I think it's difficult, or I disagree, or I have had another experience in another jurisdiction, because so yes, please do that. Sonia, thank you very much. Someone else has a prior experience or a current experience?
Yes, here is Beatriz.
Beatriz.
Yeah, I'm from Brazil. I work in a big law firm there called Machado Meyer. And together with antitrust, we had some telecom cases, mostly of them involving Telefónica, that is a big client of Machado Meyer. So I did some cases. And also before the telecommunications agency there in Brazil.
Okay, okay, super. So here as well, same thing. If you want to share experience, you just jump in. And so Beatrice, Sonia, someone else? No. Okay. What I will do is I will also try to take from the starting point that you don't know a lot. So I'm sorry also for Sonia or Beatrice. Maybe some issue may be relatively basic for you, but I think it's important that, of course, everyone is on the same page, that there is a kind of a level playing field. And so this is why I really start from the point of view that you know competition law, you know the basic of antitrust, but you don't necessarily know what is happening in the telecommunication sector in particular. So let me share my slides, and so you jump in when you want. You don't have to really raise your hands, because I am sometimes not following exactly when I present at the same time. So don't hesitate to just open your mic and jump in when you think it is useful for a question or a comment. So you see the slides? It's okay. I will try to. Okay. Okay, so I saw you at the same time. Right. So I propose to divide the presentation in 3 parts. One is a very introductory part, or what are the trend and the policy challenge today in terms of telecom regulation and antitrust, so basically public intervention. And then to focus on antitrust first, competition law, and then to go to regulation. And I start with antitrust because the European regulatory framework is very much model, if you want, or use the antitrust methodology to apply economic regulation. So it makes sense to start with antitrust and then to go to regulation. And in a way, also in Europe, the regulation is seen as a kind of a complement to antitrust, when antitrust is not really effective enough to solve the market problem. Then you rely to a more powerful tool, which is regulation. Okay, so just to start with, what are the trend, and here I have given to you in the background reading an interesting report which was done by some consultant for DG Competition at the European Commission, by some Italian consultant, economic consultant, Lear, which is a good, a small but a good consultancy firm in Italy, and they have analyzed the application of competition law in the telecom sector. And also, what is interesting in this report is that they have done some ex-post analysis of some cases, antitrust cases, merger cases, and state aid cases. You know, because what is often missing in public policies in general, and in antitrust in particular, is a kind of ex-post analysis. You know, we have taken that decision, and then after 5 years or 2 years or 3, 4, 5, 7 years, you look at how the market has evolved, and you try to assess whether the antitrust intervention, the remedy which have been imposed, for instance, have worked, and then you can learn for the next decision or for the future decision. Okay. Now, in the chapter 4 of that report, there is the trends which are mentioned and which are summarized. Now, the report is a little bit It's from some years ago now, so it's not a super recent report, but I think the trends they identified at the time are still relatively useful and reflect still the state of the market. So first, we have some technological progress in that sector. You know that telecom is one of the most, not the most, but one of the most innovative sector in the economy, and you see that yourself as a consumer. Every 10 years we have a new generation of mobile technology, for instance. I know we are at the 5th generation, each time faster with less latency time and so on. So clearly there is progress in the network, and there is progress in the core network. So this is the thing we really don't see ourselves. This is managed by the telecom players, but also at the edge, and for instance the equipment themselves, the equipment, for instance the switching equipment that the telecom firm are using, or our own equipment, are also progressing quite a bit. Now, this technological progress allows the telecom operators to provide us with a better connectivity supply. Okay, and we have seen that, of course, during the pandemic, that once from one day to another, everyone had, or most of the people had to move online, and the network were resilient enough to accommodate, let's say, this huge growth of demand. You know, so clearly that is showing, and that is possible because we have those technological progress. You know, for those who are old enough to remember the narrowband internet, you know, in the 90s in Europe, you know, if you wanted to download a movie, you had to do it before you go to bed, and then maybe the next morning you had your movies downloaded. You know. So, you know, this is something which, of course, now no one would accept that, but this was the situation at the time. Now we have a kind of what's called a very high capacity network, so a download and upload capability which are much higher than before, and also those technological progress have allowed a decrease in price per megabit. You know, you could say, okay, yes, my invoice, my telecom invoice has remained the same over the last 20 years, but the capacity that you get for the same money has dramatically improved. Okay, so clearly there is a lot of technological progress, and it's very important that any public intervention preserve this technological progress, and if anything, stimulate that innovation in the telecom sector. And then in terms of the demand, in terms of the user, what we see is, of course, more demand, and that has been clearly accelerated by the pandemics, and still today. I mean, while we are going relatively slowly out of the pandemics, the people still continue to use network much more than before. And then the other tendency is to have a bundle, that the more and more users are buying bundled products. So they are buying from the same operator their mobile connection, their television connection, their internet connection. You know, while before people were tend to buy you know, the mobile from one operator, the television from another. Okay, so that of course has also some implication on the industry, on the market structure, and on the way the states should deal with that. And then finally, and that was part of the project that we had in Europe, but also across the world, of liberalizing the sector, and that has led to more competition. You know, more competition in the fixed sector and more competition in the mobile sector. And this additional competition has increased the choice of user, and ideally and hopefully the innovation in the sector. You know, again, for those who are old enough to remember the monopoly time, I remember when I was a child in Belgium, it was still under monopoly. You had to wait, and this is not a joke, sometimes 6 months to get a fixed connection at home, because there was, of course, no mobile at the time. 6 months, unless you know a politician which could help you. So, you know, this was, again, I mean, this is something which seems absurd and inconceivable today, but that was a situation in the 70s in Belgium, where the telecom were only offered by one monopoly player. So, I mean, clearly, those trends which have been pushed by regulation, the greater competition, has helped the user. But I think the main driving force, as often in those technological sector, is not regulation. The main transformative force, it is technology and technological progress. And that is really, at the end of the day, what determines the state of the sector and the need of regulation and in this case, liberalization. Okay? So the other thing which is important to understand is that the policy challenge or the challenge for the state intervention, and here I'm talking about antitrust and regulation together, has changed over time. In Europe, and again, the experience is the same across the world. So in the 90s, the goal of Europe in the 90s were the decade where the liberalization have been, the telecom sector has been liberalized in Europe, so open to competition. So in the 90s, really the goal of the public intervention was exactly to open the market to competition and to say everyone could provide a telecom service if they want. The goal was not to privatize the company. Okay, so that's important because very often the people confuse both. But I mean, the EU in particular don't have competence, legal competence, to force a privatization. Okay, so no, so some states, have voluntarily decided to sell off some of the public telecom operator, but that has not been imposed by the European Union. What has been imposed, however, is that you could not keep your public operator under monopoly. They were forced, I mean, the states have been forced to introduce competition in the sector. Now, that was the objective of the 90s intervention of the liberalization, and it works relatively well. I mean, they always say, okay, we don't have enough competition, it could have been better, and we may discuss that, but clearly we have much more competition than before, okay? The objective of today, if you read the document of the European Commission, the strategy document of the European Commission, are very different. Now, the objective of today is to ensure connectivity, because we realize that in an age of big data and in an age of Internet of Things and in an age where many people are working at home or working at home partially, connectivity is absolutely key. Okay, and so that is really now the policy challenge in Europe and elsewhere, is to ensure that the public intervention stimulate the deployment of connectivity. Now, that do not mean that competition is not important, and competition is one of the driving force to get connectivity, because it's because you are afraid that some of your competitor will get the consumer because they have a better network, that you will be incentivized to improve your own network. So competition may help connectivity, but really the ultimate objective today is to ensure that there is this deployment of this very high capacity network. So that means what? That means a lot of new investment in very high capacity network, mostly 5G mobile network and fiber fixed network. Okay, so and that is costing a lot of money. And one question, of course, is who will pay for that? Will it be the telecom players? Will it be what the telecom players call the over the top? So that is in fact the digital platform. Or will it be the state? Now, ultimately, it will be us. To one way or another, ultimately, it will be us. But the question is whether it's us through subscription to your telecom players, so your invoice to the telecom players will increase. Will it be us through paying more to the digital company, to the digital platform? Now, you will say, well, in general, we don't pay. But as you know, we pay with our data, and they are using our data to sell advertisement. So in one way or another, we pay them as well. Or will it be us paying the tax to the states, which will subsidize the deployment of very high capacity network, in particular in a rural area where the business case for deploying those infrastructure is less clear. You see, and so really the point here is the objective is to ensure that the regulation and the antitrust intervention stimulate everyone to invest more into digital connectivity. Okay. Now, what does it mean in particular? The EU has set up. Oops, I'm going too quickly. Sorry for that. The EU has set up several connectivity objectives. One is for 2025, and those were set up 10 years ago, or in 2016. And there, the idea, and you see the idea of the 2025 objective that all European households would have a connection which allow for 100 megabits per second download, and that for the urban area and some let's say major area, like a major infrastructure area like a road or railways, 5G should be available, and that for some let's say important public hub like school, university, research centers, and so on, a connection of at least 1 gigabit per second should be available. Okay, that was the objective, and we are about to meet them that were set up for Europe in 2016, and to be achieved in 2025. And then there is now a new roadmap, if you want, for 2030, which has been agreed last year. So in general, you know, that's how Europe function. You know, they set up some objective for the decade, and that is the called digital compass that you find at the bottom of the slide. No, it's a compass because I mean, there is 4 main categories of objective or target to be achieved by the European Union in 2030. Some are related to the digitization of public services. Some are related to the multiplication of digital skill. Some are related to the digitization of businesses. But then, you know, to achieve all of that, to achieve digitization of public services and business, you need good infrastructure. Okay, and so the objective on the right of the compass, you see 4 category of sub-objective regarding infrastructure, and one of them relate to connectivity. Okay, the others relate to more the semiconductor, which is, you know, one of the big projects of this commission, and in particular Thierry Breton. Another one is data, and finally on high computing power. So infrastructure is not only telecom network, but telecom network is part of the infrastructure that you need to have a digital society. And there really the idea is to upgrade, let's say, the previous objectives, because the idea would be to have a gigabit for everyone. So not only 100 megabit, but 1000 megabit for everyone. And then 5G deployed everywhere, and not only in some major cities or a major infrastructural part of the territory. Okay, so you see a kind of an upgrade of the objective because it was seen as important for the data society, if you want, for the digital society. Now, all of that costs a lot of money, and this is what the Commission estimated in 2016, how much the upgrade of the network to achieve the 2025 objective, not the digital compass one, 2025 objective would require. And the Commission says it will require at least 500 billion euro in investment. So, you know, this is not negligible. And why it's so costly? Mostly because if you have to put fiber in the street, you have to dig the street, and you have to put a new infrastructure in the street. So this is not very high, you know, necessarily high skilled job that are necessary, but this is a lot of labor cost which cannot be replaced by machine. Well, I mean, of course, those people who dig in the street, they are using machine, but I mean, still, it's a very labor-intensive job, and so this is why it is extremely costly to do that. And so, as I said, the real question is who will finance that, and how the regulation will, let's say, share the burden of financing the deployment of this new infrastructure. Okay, so I tell you that. So this is not at this stage we have not addressed the legal issue yet, but we will go back to that. But I think it's important to have that that in mind when you think about what we are trying to do in telecom. And then the last type of information I wanted to give you in this introduction is, but where are we in meeting those objectives? And there, we could say, where are we at the European level, but also where are we in each member state? Because, very often when we speak about Europe, we hide the fact that there is a lot of divergences and differences across member states. So, and for that, there is a very important report, annual report that the European Commission is adopting every year, which is called DESI, Digital Economic and Society Index. So if you are interested by the progress of Europe in terms of digitization and of its member states, go to that report. It's an extremely interesting report, annual report, which is in general adopted in December. And so here it is the index related to connectivity. So the report is very much based on the 4 main objectives of the digital compass. So there is one section on skills, one section on public services, one section on businesses, and then one section on connectivity. And one section on infrastructure, and there one section on connectivity. And on the connectivity section, you could see which are the best, let's say, players in Europe and which are the worst. And you see how it is calculate this index, what is the level of fixed broadband, not very high capacity. So when I say broadband, it's just high capacity take up. So the take up is how many people are subscribing to a broadband connection. Then fixed broadband coverage. So how many people could potentially have a broadband connection, because as you know, there are some regions, in particular the rural region, which are called in general the white area in the technical language, where you don't have a possibility of having a broadband connection. Then the broadband, the mobile broadband that are available, and then finally the broadband prices. Okay, and if you, let's say, look at those 4 dimensions, now you may discuss why those 4 and why not others, but okay, this is a methodological discussion that the Commission had, and it's not surprising, the better player in Europe are the Nordic countries. So Denmark first, and then also the Netherlands is very good, but also Spain, for instance, is extremely good, Luxembourg, Sweden, and then Germany. And so you find at the end Greece, Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Cyprus in Egypt. Okay, so no, I mean, this thing could be explained by a lot of elements. Of course, if you have a country where you have a lot of islands, and this is more complicated to ensure connectivity, so that may partly explain why Greece is at the end. But also, this is also explained by the policy, and so I don't mean that the policy of Greece is a disaster and the policy of Denmark is super good, but because, as I said, there is some geographical element, the density of the population, and everything is playing a role. But still, I mean, policy has an influence on what you can achieve. And then, in terms of, if we go to the next slide, which is the objective of the deployment and the take-up of very high capacity network, what you see in the graph is that clearly you see an improvement of the coverage. So again, the availability, not necessarily the take-up, but the availability of very high capacity network in Europe overall. And what is interesting is that, and it's not surprising, of course, is that the total of coverage, which is covering urban and rural area, is much higher than the rural area, because, of course, the economies of scale and scope in the rural area are less important. So it's not surprising that the very high capacity network is arriving in a slower manner, more slowly in the rural area than in the urban area. Okay, but again, I think what is interesting is to look at the difference in the member states, because it's very different. And there, if you look at which is the best country, which has in fact a 100% coverage for rural and urban area, that is Malta. Now, of course, Malta, I don't know if you have been there, but Malta is a small country, relatively dense. So, I mean, you can cover it much more easily than, again, a country which are at the bottom of the list, which is Greece, where you have a bit of coverage in the urban area, but nothing at all in the rural area. Okay. So I think what is interesting is that there are some progress over the years. That is clear, and that is shown by the graph on the top left. But still, there are some effort to do, in particular for some countries, and in particular for the rural area. Okay. So this is what I wanted to tell you in terms of for context. Do you have some question or remark or?
Yes, I have one about the connectivity index. This is also related, I believe, to the economy of each of the member states, right? We are not only talking about the infrastructure of coverage, because for what I see, most of the countries that are here are the richest ones, and you see the poorest ones in with low coverage. So just to see your views on this, and how the European Commission or the regulatory bodies of telecom deal with this, if they try to compensate one country in comparison with the other.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because indeed, I mean, part of the explanation is regulation, part of the explanation is the size and the density and the type of the country, and part of the explanation is the richness of the country and its user. And of course, you know, if you are a rich country where people are ready to pay a lot for their internet subscription, you have a higher business case to build those very high capacity network than if not. So you are perfectly right that it is an important dimension. Now, what the EU is doing on that is there are some specific funds which are allocated for the poorest countries of or the poorest region. It's not at the country level, but at the regional level of those countries, of the poorest region in Europe, to try to catch up with the others. Okay, so there are some funds which are foreseen, but they are not specifically dedicated, let's say, to telecom infrastructure. I mean, it's up to each member states to decide how. So those funds are calculated according to your GDP and your GDP lag, let's say, compared to the European average. Then you receive those funds, and it's up to you to decide with the approval of the Commission, but it's mostly the member states which are in charge of where they allocate those funds. Is it for telecom infrastructure? Is it for hospital? Is it for social security? Is it for infrastructure project like a road or port or whatever? So you see, there are some funds, but the EU is not necessarily controlling where those funds are going. Now, after the COVID crisis, a specific fund has been created, and that is particularly to help the country which have been the most hit by the COVID crisis. And therefore, that fund, which is huge, and it was 750 billion euro overall, 20% had to be given for a digital project, not necessarily connectivity project, but digital project. You know, it could have been also digitization of the administration, all those kind of things. But and several of those funds have indeed been allocated to the deployment of fiber and of 5G. Okay, so yes, so the EU is doing a bit on it, but clearly the EU alone cannot, level the playing field for all the European Union countries or regions. Okay. Other question or remark? No. If not, then let me go to the second part, which is which will be more substantive and longer. That is introductory part, which is about competition policy. And there, what I wanted to do is to follow, let's say, the same logic or the normal logic of a competition law analysis. So starting with how market power is assessed, and behind market power you have two questions: market definition and dominance assessment, and then go to how you assess the abuse of dominance in the country, then how you assess the anti-competitive agreement, and finally the merger control. Okay, so this is the four elements that I wanted to deal with you, and there are specifically two readings or three readings that you have in the background, readings which could help you on that. One is a paper I wrote on the action of the Commission regarding mostly abuse of dominant position, so that could be useful for this, let's say, second part. Then there is another paper on the mobile merger by a number of lawyers of Cleary Gottlieb, which is interesting and very pedagogical, because as we see, there has been and there continue to be a quite of a consolidation in the mobile industry, and so the question is how Europe is dealing with that. And then there is the Lear report that I was mentioning before in introduction, which is also dealing with a number of cases, and in fact dealing with some abuse of dominant cases, agreement cases, merger cases, and state aid cases. Okay, so I think those, let's say, three readings are useful if you want to go a bit further in some of the issues which are mentioned here. Okay, so what are, do you think, the difficulty in defining market in the digital industry, in the telecom industry? Sorry, what could be the difficulty or the adaptation which are necessary, do you think? Because the characteristic of the telecom industry, it is that it is a network industry. We are in the module of network industry. It's a tangible network industry. Now, what do you think these characteristics imply for market definition? I don't know who has an idea, or Sonia or Beatrice, what were the difficulty you face when you define market in telecoms? Who wants to jump in? Or do you think it's an easy exercise and there is no really much to discuss? Because you see, and you have seen in the other module, I mean, market definition very often determine the outcome of your antitrust case. So the market definition part may sound so technical things, but it is also very, very important, because the way you will define your market often will determine the result of your case, and as always in an antitrust cases, you have the company which are calling for a very broad market definition, so their market share could in a way be diluted, while and so they will not be found as having a dominant position, while the antitrust agencies tends to go for a narrow market definition, and so they can more easily show that that your company has market power. And so this debate that you have generally in antitrust, you find it also, of course, in competition in telecom. Now, one big difficulty, or let's say characteristic of defining market in telecom and in every network industry. You will see it's the same in energy, as you may have seen, is that first you have to define two families of market. One is the retail markets. That is the relationship between a telecom players and an end user. So if you interact with the telecom players, this is a retail market. This is the market we see each of us. And then there is a wholesale market, which is an upstream market, upstream to the retail market, which are the relationship between telecom players. So for instance, if you have a new entrant, a new telecom company, which do not have a network, how it can operate in the market by renting the network of the existing player, of the incumbent, okay? And so what will happen is that you will deal with this newcomer, so that is the retail market, and this newcomer will have to rent the infrastructure to the incumbent, and that is the wholesale market, okay? So that's a big, and that's a market that you don't see, you as an end user, but which is extremely important and which will be instrumental in creating competition and in allowing these newcomers to offer a service to you. Because of course, it's impossible for every telecom operator to build their own complete, comprehensive network all over the country. You know, that will not be economically rational, and in a way it will take quite a bit of time. Okay, so that's the first distinction to have, is the retail markets and the wholesale markets. Okay, and those are families of market. Now, in the retail market itself, you can pay every day, every month for the access line, so the access to internet, and then sometimes you may want to pay in addition some specific services. Okay, and those are possibly two different markets. Now, for the wholesale market, we will see that there is two main, let's say, subcategory of market, which are called the access market, and that is the case where the example I was giving to you, when a new entrant wants to give access, has to rent the network of the incumbent for providing its services. That's the access market. And then you have the termination market. Now that's different. Let's suppose that you have two mobile operators which have their own network. Okay, so everyone has its own network and cover the whole country. For instance, in Belgium, you have Proximus, which are a network covering the whole territory, and then you have Orange, which has another network covering the whole territory. But what happens if a customer of Proximus network calls someone on an Orange network? It's possible because there is an interconnection between both networks. But what will happen is that the Proximus customer will pay the call to the Proximus network, but Proximus will have to pay a wholesale termination charge to Orange, because, you know, at some point Orange will have to terminate the call to the Orange customer, because Proximus do not have access to that Orange customer. Okay, so the termination charge is different. Is not, you know, a new entrant which do not have enough network and so wants to rent the network of the incumbents. It is two networks which are comprehensive, complete, but it's happened that the conversation is taking place between one person on one network and one person on another network, and so you need to interconnect the network, and you need the originating network, in my example Proximus, to pay something for the terminating network, in my example Orange. Okay, and so for you as the Proximus customer calling your friend on Orange, you don't see that wholesale charge, wholesale termination charge, but it is paid. And of course, the higher this wholesale termination charge is, the higher you could expect that what you will have to pay to Proximus will be. Because of course, Proximus will say, okay, this is a wholesale charge I have to pay. This is a cost for me that will add to your invoice. Okay. So basically, those are, let's say, the subfamily of wholesale market, the access to the network and the termination to the network. Okay. So those are important, and those are, I think, the main particularity, let's say, of market definition in telecom. So you continue to apply the traditional, let's say, SNP test. And so my point is not to say that you have to have other methodology to define market in telecom. The point is more to say that given the characteristics of the network industries, you have to define a series of families of market, retail, wholesale, and in the wholesale, access and termination. Okay. Now, if you zoom, if we zoom in on, on retail market, one of the big trends I was mentioning to you before is the bundling of services. So that more and more people, a customer, are buying not one services per operators, but all their services. So mobile, television, and internet mostly. And the question is whether you have to define a market for the bundled services, or whether you continue to define a market per service. Okay. And there, in fact, you apply the traditional SNP test. So, you know, if the price of the bundle increased from 5 to 10%, and the people continue to buy the bundle and do not unpick the bundle and say, okay, because the bundle has increased from 5 to 10%, I will buy my mobile from one and my fixed connection to another. So if the price increase of 5 to 10% is profitable for the hypothetical bundler, then bundling is a market. And if not, of course, bundle is not a market. Okay. So again, I mean, you apply the SNP test, but to the particularity of the market. And then in terms of the wholesale market, and in particular the access market, and here it's a very simplified and stylized view of the of a telecom network that I have taken from a book by Maginelli and Nichita. But the idea is that, and this is what important to see, is that you have different technology. No, I will not enter into the detail of those different technology, but the point is that if you take the most advanced technology or the very high capacity network, it's called the fiber to the home. So this is mean. So this is the home. This is where the end user lives, and this is the telecom network. And the fiber to the home means that you have fiber which go up to your home, your specific home. And that is the objective of the very high capacity network deployment. But sometimes, you know, because this is very costly, what you have is a technology which is called fiber to the cabinet. So, you know, in every street, you can look, you have those cabinet of 1 meters or a bit less than 1 meters, where all the line of the street are coming and are concentrated to that cabinet, and so that cabinet is related to a more important line, which is taking all the call or all the internet connection from that street to another what's called local exchange. Okay. Now, sometimes the fiber is only arriving at the cabinet, and the connection between the street cabinet and your home is still done with a copper technology, which is, of course, less rapid than a fiber technology. Okay, so of course the people which have only a fiber to the cabinet connection have a less speedy connection than fiber to the home. But I mean, at this stage with the service that we use, it's normally sufficient. Okay, and so and the third technology is XDSL. So that's the technology, the previous technology where the fiber only arrives to the local exchange, and the part from the local exchange to the cabinet and from the cabinet to the house is only done through a copper. So therefore here, of course, the bandwidth that you can get is even less important than here. Now, the point I want to, I show you that just for you to understand, let's say, the main technology, and the point is, of course, the higher the fiber is in the network, the more costly it will be, but the better the connection will be as well. But the point also is to say that the entrance can decide to have a connection and to connect to the incumbent network at the core exchange, at the local exchange, or at the cabinet, you know, depending of what the new entrant has as a network. If it has nothing at all, it will, in the country, it will have to connect at the core exchange. If it has some, let's say, connection, it may be able to connect every local exchange. You have a local exchange per, let's say, area. I think in Belgium at some point you had 650 local exchange. Or if it has a very capillary network, but it doesn't manage to connect the house themselves, then new entrants can connect at the cabinet level. Okay, so you know, when we speak about an access market, you should differentiate of where you connect or what kind of access do you need. You know, do you need an access at the core level? Do you need an access at the local exchange, or do you need an access at the cabinet level? Of course, more you if you need an access at the core exchange, you rent more than if you only need an access at the cabinet level and you only rent this part. So of course, if you have an access here, you will pay much more than if you get an access only at the cabinet level. Okay. So this is just to say that the access market is in fact depending of where you ask for the access. And so, for example, this is a decision, a very a relatively old decision of the Commission, a merger decision, when Vodafone, who is a mobile company, decide to enter in the cable industries, and they have done that move 10 years ago already. Why do you think, in fact, Vodafone, which was at the origin a mobile-only company, decided to buy cable? And they bought Cable Germany, Cable Deutschland, but they bought many other cable companies across Europe. Why do you think Vodafone did that? So they had a very good mobile infrastructure, but then they decided 10 years ago, and it was an important strategic decision that Vodafone did, to buy fixed company. And the one which were up for sale were in general the cable company. Now, why do you think they did that move? What's the reason? If you were the chair of the CEO of Vodafone at the time, why would you decide to buy a fixed connection that you didn't have? Who has an idea?
To be able to use this infrastructure and reach a bigger number of users, and not to fix a telephony, but maybe to internet and other.
So they were able to connect everyone, because with their mobile connection, they were able to connect everyone. So the idea was not to get more, I mean, to connect in abstracto more customer, because they were able to connect everyone with their mobile. But your second element is important. You know, why do you think they wanted to connect with fixed as well? With a fixed connection? I think, you know, there was two main reasons. One is because they saw this trend of that the consumer wants to bundle their services. So they want to buy from the same operator, mobile and fixed internet, and also television. And so, you know, if Vodafone was not able to propose a fixed connection, while some competitors were able to propose a fixed and a mobile connection, like for instance in Belgium, Proximus is proposing to you, because Proximus has a mobile and a fixed network, then they will lose on the competition on bundle. Okay, so that was one of the reasons. The second reason is that they were realizing that fixed network may also be useful to support part of the mobile network. Okay, they can use part of the, for instance, you know, when you have to connected to mobile tower, they are connected through fixed network, not through a mobile network. Okay, so the mobile part is between your smartphone and the nearest tower, but all the rest is done on a fixed on a fixed infrastructure. And so also to improve the quality of the mobile operation, sorry, I think Vodafone was interested to have that fixed that fixed network. No, that is the reason why Vodafone bought cable. But the reason why I show you this table is that this slide is that this is all the market which have been identified by the Commission in the context of that merger. And as you can see, you know, the Commission defined a family for fixed market, and a family for mobile market, and then a family for multi-play or bundle. And then for each of those, define some wholesale market and some retail market. Okay, so this is why when you start to define a list of market in telecom, you know, it can end up to be a long list. That was really the point that I want to make. Okay, so what I suggest to do is, as I have announced, we do a very short break here of 5 minutes. Okay, no more. We will do a longer break in 1 hour, but just to stretch your legs and take coffee or something like that. But so we start again in 5 minutes. Would that work? Okay, so see you at 3:05. Okay, so I suggest we start again. So if you can put your camera on while I am sharing the slides. Right. Okay. So the next issue, of course, after having defined market, is to determine whether on that market firms have a dominant position. And as you know, I mean, the European Commission in the Article 82 priority paper or guidance paper identified 3 criteria for finding a dominant position. One is the market share, which is indicating to you the current level of competition. The other one is the entry barriers, which is indicating to you the level of potential competition, but which is of course important. And then the third element is whether, even if you have high market share and low entry barriers, and high entry barriers, you are not setting up the price, or you don't have a power over price, because your customer is so powerful then they can in a way dictate the price they will pay to you, and that is called the countervailing buying power. Now, if we apply those 3 criteria to telecom, what does it lead? In terms of market share, what is interesting is that the market share tends to be still relatively high in some countries. So for instance, if you take the fixed broadband subscription, and as you have seen before, the Commission still tends to differentiate a fixed market and a mobile market. What you see in this graph on the top left is that over the years, the market share of the incumbent, so the main player, so that would be Proximus in Belgium, that would be Deutsche Telekom in the Netherlands, that will be Orange in France, has decreased from 60% to 40% overall in Europe, while the market share of the new entrants, so all the others, have increased. But of course, this is interesting to see whether the liberalization program has worked, but does not give you any indication on the dominant position, because the fixed market are still national. They are not European. So what you have to look is this second graph on the bottom of the slides, which is what are the market share of the incumbent or of the new entrants per country. And what you see, for instance, is that in Luxembourg, the market share of the incumbent is above 60%. So clearly, as you know, the criteria is 40–50% market share to decide whether you are a dominant player or not. But so clearly, if you go to Luxembourg or Cyprus, you could say without any doubt that the player, I mean the incumbent, is a dominant player. On the other hand, if you go to Romania, the Czech Republic, or Poland, you could see that the market share of the incumbent is very, very low, and so they are not anymore probably not anymore dominant. Okay, so I think it's important to look at the market share and to look at the market share per country to determine whether the incumbents, so the one which are there first, has a dominant position. But as we know, market share is not everything. You have to also look at barrier to entry. And here, I think we can safely say that in telecom, the barrier to entry tends to be relatively high. Okay, and so if you have a high barrier, if you have a high market share, normally it should be enough to show that you have a dominant position, because the market, the entry barrier tends to be high as well. Why? Because, you know, if you want to offer a mobile service, very often you will have to buy a spectrum license. And so this is a form of legal barrier. If you want to offer a fixed services, you don't have to buy a spectrum license, but you have to dig in the street. And so you have a lot of fixed costs, a huge fixed cost, which is a form of barrier to entry. So I would say that in telecom, because the barrier to entry are relatively high, the market share is a relatively good proxy to determine whether you have a dominant position or not. Okay, so those are the three main criteria that the Commission is using in antitrust. Now, what is interesting is that in 2018, the Commission adopted, in the context of the telecom regulation, so in regulation, a very important guidelines who says how you assess market power in telecom. Now, this is important because, as I will show you later, the telecom regulation is based on antitrust methodology. And so you will regulate telecom operator which are equivalent to which have an equivalent to a dominant position. Now, it is called significant market power, just to distinguish the name, because it's a test, it's a threshold that you use in regulation, not in antitrust. But it's based on the same methodology. So the way you determine whether a company has a significant market power is exactly the same as the way you determine whether a telecom operator has a dominant position. And so this is why the criteria that the Commission is proposing in those guidelines of 2018 on how you determine significant market power are the same as the one you will use in antitrust. And what is interesting is that you could also read this Commission guidelines as a kind of sector-specific antitrust criteria. Okay. And here you see a long list, much more than the three main ones that you find in the general guidelines of antitrust, but which are more or less the same. Barrier to entry, barrier to expansion, relative size of the undertaking, control of infrastructure, which are not easily duplicable, and so on. So I will not go through the whole list. You can go it yourself, and you can just click on the link here if you want to find the guidelines itself. But I think what is useful is that you could read those 2018 guidelines as a form of sector-specific antitrust and also regulatory instrument. Okay. Now that is for single dominant. But as we know, there is another concept which is also very important in European antitrust, which is collective dominance. You know, and this is a bit of a kind of paradoxical concept, because the idea is that several players can together have a dominant position. So it's not one player which is extremely powerful on the market, has over 50% of the market with high barrier to entry. It is so none of the player has a single dominant position, but together they have a collective dominant position. And the Commission gave that the Court of Justice in Ertour and then Impala. In Ertour it was the General Court, and in Impala it was the Court of Justice, gave the three criteria to find a collective dominant position. Okay, it should be when the market are transparent, so the different company could get to what's called a focal point, and this is an example of a focal point, you know, and this is a real picture taken on a UK highway, where, you know, as in every country, the petrol station have to announce the price they charge. And in that M5, which is one of the main highway in the UK, all the petrol station at 2 miles, 15 miles, and 25 miles were charging the exact same price for petrol and for diesel. Okay. Now, those three petrol stations are not part of the same group, and they are not singly dominant. But the fact that they charge the exact same price, you could say that they are collectively dominant, and a price which is above the cost, because they managed to get what's called a focal point. So the focal point here is the exact same price, so 116 pence for petrol. Okay. They so there is a kind of transparency which, and this is contributing to transparency in a way, which allows them to get to the focal point, but also, and that's the most important condition for collective dominance, they have an incentive to remain on that focal point. So none of the three petrol stations here have an interest to cheat and just charge a little lower price. So every car on the M5 highway who needs petrol will go there. They don't have an interest to do that because they know that if they do that, then they will trigger a price war, and then everyone will be worse off. Okay, so you have an interest, you have a possibility to get to a focal point, and also an incentive to remain on that focal point because of transparency and because of the risk of a price war. Now, what is interesting is whether in telecom you also have this kind of situation. And there again, if you look at the same guidelines of the Commission of 2018, there is one section on single dominance. And then there is another section on collective dominance. And the Commission is saying that there are some cases where the telecom operators, none of them will be singly dominant, but together they will be collective dominant. And the example which is often mentioned in the guidelines is that, you know, for instance, in Belgium, you have 3 mobile operators, which is called in the technical jargon, MNO, for mobile network operator. So you have 3 operators which have both a network, a spectrum license from the Belgian government. And those are Proximus, Orange, and the third one from Telenet. Okay. Now, maybe some of you have a mobile connection which are not from Orange, Proximus, or Telenet. They are from, for example, from Carrefour, you know, from the retailer Carrefour. Carrefour do not have a mobile network, but sell SIM cards. How they do? They are what's called a MVNO, mobile virtual network operator. Virtual because they don't have their own network. What they do, in fact, is that they rent the network of Orange, Proximus, or Telenet. Okay, they rent it, but they don't have the spectrum license. So what you have in Belgium and in every countries of the world, in fact, you have a small number of mobile operator which have their spectrum license, and then a huge number of MVNO which are renting the network of the MNO, or one network of the MNO. Now, in some country, and it has happened in Spain, for instance, the 3 mobile network operator, all of them refuse to rent their network to an MVNO, all of them, which is, if you think of it, a bit strange because, you know, very often you still have spare capacity in your mobile network, and so it's good to rent it because then you make more money. Why they were not doing it? Because they didn't want to have more competition on the mobile market. But the fact that the 3 of them do it shows that they are in a kind of collective dominant position. You know, it's a bit the same thing as the petrol station I was just mentioning before. Not that they charge the same price, but that they will, all of them, collectively refuse to give access to an MVNO. And that is a typical situation where you can find, and in fact, the Spanish regulator has found that the 3 Spanish MNO had a collective dominant position, and therefore they have been regulated, and therefore they have been forced, in fact, to give access to the Spanish MVNO. And this is why now, if you go in Spain, you will see that there are some MVNO, but they have been made possible thanks to the intervention of the Spanish regulatory authority, which forced the 3 MNO to rent their network to MVNO. Okay, so this is an example of a collective dominant position in telecom. As you may have seen in the other module, and in particular in the abuse of dominance module, it's very rare that the Commission had found collective dominance, but so telecom is in a good example where this has happened. Okay. So we have seen market definition. We have seen dominance assessment, single and collective. And as you know, in Europe, a dominant position is not illegal in itself. Okay, so you have to show that this dominant position has been abused to condemn a company. And here, as you probably know as well, there are two main families of abuse of dominant position: the exploitative abuse and the exclusionary. Okay. The exploitative abuse is that when the dominant company directly exploit consumer, in particular by charging excessive price, while the exclusionary abuse is a situation where the dominant company exclude efficient competitor out of the market. Okay, and so reduce the competitive process, which ultimately is not good for the consumer, of course. So those are the two types of abuse, and in general, the antitrust agencies. Now, it's interesting, for instance, to know that in the US, you don't have exploitative abuse, you only have exclusionary abuse. Okay, and some other jurisdiction of the world. So, in a way, the possibility of condemning excessive pricing or exploitative abuse, this is not widely shared across every antitrust law of the world, but we have that in Europe. We have that in Europe, but in practice, the antitrust agencies, the European Commission or the national antitrust agencies, are a bit reluctant to condemn exploitative pricing or exploitative abuse, because they think that then they will end up to be a kind of a price regulator, and because if you say a price is excessive, then you have to give the price which is not excessive. And antitrust agencies are reluctant to become a price regulator. They say maybe that's the job of a regulatory authority, but it's not our job. Our job is to make the market works better, but not to regulate the price. And so in general, you don't have a lot of excessive price case in antitrust. But again, here, telecom is a kind of a particular case or an outlier, because there has been several cases which have been started by the Commission on excessive pricing in telecom. And I mentioned those cases in my paper on the antitrust activism of the Commission in telecom. So if you are interested by that, you can find a reference of those cases in my paper. But what is interesting is that the Commission took those cases at the very beginning of liberalization, so in the 90s. They didn't take those cases, no. Because what happened in the 90s? In the 90s, you had the incumbents, so the previous legal monopolists, which were hyper dominant, super dominant. And so they were able to charge very important prices. And so, because, you know, liberalization takes time. You have to have new players coming, and then those new players having new customer and exercising competitive pressure and so on. So it's not because you liberalize a sector, then the day after you have a lot of competition, and therefore the price going down. You know, it takes between 10 and 15 years, you know, for competition to really emerge. So in the meanwhile, the Commission says, I want to show results. I want to show result to consumer. I want to show that prices are decreasing. Because, you know, the liberalization program in the 90s were contested. Some people say we don't want it. We don't want it. And so the Commission had to deliver very quickly. And how they did that in a very astute way. They say, okay, we will open a lot of antitrust case for excessive price. And we will say to the company, either you reduce your price or we condemn you. And it worked very, very well, because indeed many companies reduce their price, sometimes from 80%. So they were halving their price on some services, just not to have a condemnation for the Commission. And so the Commission was happy, because they could see, look, I mean, my program of liberalization worked because prices are going down, you know. while in fact the price were going down, not because of the liberalization, but because of the antitrust action. But whatever, I mean, the people, I mean, the end user don't care. I mean, they don't care how it comes from, but they just care that their prices are going down. Okay, so this is why the Commission used in a very strategic way, I would say, the excessive price action at the beginning of the 90s to show that the liberalization program had a sense. No, they don't do it anymore because you have real competition. And so clearly you have less excessive price that you had in the 90s. So that was really some case which happened at the beginning of the liberalization, but not anymore. Now, what you have now is much more exclusionary abuse cases. And there, as you have seen in the module on abuse, there are different types of exclusionary abuse. But in telecom, you have, let's say, three main types of abuse. One is predatory price, and the Wanadoo case is one example of it. The other one, and the, let's say, main abuse that you find in telecom is called price squeeze. And for instance, Deutsche Telekom, that I will discuss in a minute, is an example. And then the third type of abuse is refusal to give access to your network. So refusal to give access. And it's important because, as I was telling you before, if you are a new entrant, very often you don't have any networks, and so you have to rent the network of the incumbent. Now, regulation is about forcing the incumbent to rent the network, but if regulation is not working well, or while regulation was not yet there, the only possibility that the entrant had was to rely on competition law, and says that and claims that a refusal to give access is against competition law. Okay, so three main types of abuse: predatory price, price squeeze, and refusal to give access. So let me briefly mention those cases, but again, I mean, they are mentioned in my paper, so if you want to have more detail, you have the reference there. So in 2003, the European Commission condemned Wanadoo, which was the internet service provider of the what was called at the time France Télécom, and which is called now Orange Group, so which was the French incumbent. And what happened is that between 1990 and 2001, the price of the the broadband internet connection, the ADSL, were below average variable cost, so basically below the marginal cost. So on every connection sold, Wanadoo was making a loss. And then from 2001 and 2002, the price were above the marginal cost, but still below the average total cost, or if you want, the average cost. So they were making a loss if you take the fixed cost into account. Now, why Wanadoo did that? Because in at the turn of the century, it was at the same time in the Western Europe, the people were moving from narrowband internet to broadband. I mean, to the first generation of broadband internet. And in narrowband internet, you had a lot of competition between several internet service providers in France. And Wanadoo says, I want to dominate the internet broadband connection. So I will charge for the French customer a price below the cost. And because I am part of a big French group, which was still state-owned at the time, I can make losses there. Okay, and you eliminate all the smaller competitors which are not able to sustain those losses. So the strategy works well because, in fact, the market share of Wanadoo in terms of internet service provision in France went from 46% to 72% in a market which was growing. So not only that their market share, not only that the market was growing, but their market share of that growing market was growing as well. So it's proved that this strategy worked extremely well. And so the Commission condemned Wanadoo for predatory pricing, applying the standard AXO case of the court, which has been developed by the court 10 years before. As you can imagine, Wanadoo went before the Court of Justice, but in 2009, the court confirmed that the commission was right, and that Wanadoo had indeed abuse of its dominant position for a predatory price. Now, there is only one case of predatory price, but there is a lot of cases of price squeeze at the European level, and many more also at the national level. Now, a price squeeze is a little bit different than a predatory price, because a predatory price is that a price which is below your cost. So you have to know the cost. And very often it's complicated to know the cost. In particular, in an industry where you have a lot of fixed costs that you have to allocate across different services. So in a way, it's very complicated to bring a predatory price in telecom, because you have to calculate the cost. It's not impossible, as the Commission has proved in Wanadoo, but it's difficult. A bit easier is a price squeeze, because there you don't need to calculate the cost. You only need to show that the retail price that the dominant company is charging to the end user is, the margin between the retail price and the wholesale price that the dominant company is charging to its competitor to rent its line is insufficient for a business case. So typically what happened in the Dutch Telecom case that I was mentioning before, Dutch Telecom was charging to the German customer a certain retail price. Okay. And at the same time, Deutsche Telekom was charging to the new telecom entrants in Germany a wholesale price to rent the line of Deutsche Telekom. Okay. Now, what happened in that case is that between 1998 and 2001, the wholesale price were higher than the retail price. So that's an absurd situation where if you are the new entrants, you have to pay, for instance, the line, you have to rent the network at, let's say, 10 euro a month for one line. Well, if you are an end user, a German end user, you could get that line for 8 euro. So of course there is no possible business case. If a new entrant has to rent the line at 10 euro, plus it has its own retail cost, it's impossible that they price something at 8 euro for the end user. And of course, if they price more than 8 euro, the people will say, I stay with Deutsche Telekom because they charge me 8 euro. Why would I go to a new entrant with charge 10 euro plus their retail cost, so let's say 12 euro. So we had an absurd situation where, absurd economically, where the wholesale price were higher than the retail price. And so you have a negative margin. Then after 2001, the margin became positive, because what happened is that the Deutsche Telekom reduced the wholesale price. So instead of charging 12 or 10 in my example, they were charging 7. So they reduced the wholesale price, but still the margin between the retail price, 8 in my example, and the wholesale price, 7 in my example, were not enough to cover the retail cost of the new entrants. Because next to renting the network, you have a lot of retail costs. You have your billing cost, you have your advertising cost, you have your customer care cost and everything. So, clearly the margin between the wholesale and the retail should be sufficient to cover the retail cost of Deutsche Telekom. And what the Commission says is, look, first you have a negative margin, then you have a margin which do not allow you, Deutsche Telekom, to cover your own retail costs. So you do that because you wanted to exclude your competitor, the new entrant. And so this is why they have been condemned by the European Commission in 2003 as well, the same year as the Wanadoo decision. Now, the difficulty in that case is that Deutsche Telekom was regulated by the German regulator. So the retail price were regulated in a form of a basket, and the wholesale price were regulated as well. So Deutsche Telekom says two things before the court. One is that price squeeze is not an abuse in and of itself. You have to prove that either a price is predatory or a price is excessive, but you always have to compare with the cost. Here, you cannot just say the margin is insufficient independently of the cost. So that was one argument. And the other argument that the Deutsche Telekom made before the court is to say, I am regulated. So they were invoking a kind of regulated conduct defense, saying you cannot condemn me under antitrust when I comply with regulation. No, on both of those accounts, Deutsche Telekom lost. And so this is why this Deutsche Telekom case is so important, because it is raising two very important questions of EU antitrust law. On the first account, the court says, contrary to the US Supreme Court, which had a kind of similar case in Linkline in 2007, the Court of Justice of Europe says, yes, the list of abuse that you find in the treaty is an open list, and therefore, next to the predatory price abuse or the excessive price abuse, which have been recognized in the past, I can recognize a new abuse, which is the price squeeze. And so for the first time, it's not exactly the first time, but one of the first cases, the Court of Justice confirmed that a price squeeze is a specific abuse. First thing. Second, on the second point, the court says, yes, it is true that if you are regulated, this should be taken into account in the antitrust analysis. I agree with that. But, says the court, within regulation, you had a possibility to reduce the price squeeze. Because it is true that the German regulator was regulating your retail price and your wholesale price, but they were not regulating each and every price. They were just saying all your retail prices, so all the one you charge, should be no more than X. But within that basket of services which were regulated, you could increase some and decrease others, retail price. And says the court, if you had done that, you would have eliminated the price squeeze. So the court says, it is true that you are regulated, but you still have within that regulation a margin of maneuver which allows you to alleviate the price squeeze. And this is because you didn't use this margin of maneuver to alleviate the price squeeze, or to put it another way, you use this margin of maneuver to abuse your dominant position. That that the Commission was correct in condemning you. Okay, so I think the case is extremely interesting on those two accounts, and is really one of the most probably important cases that we have in antitrust, in European antitrust. And also it's interesting because it's different from the case law in the US. Now, I will not go into the detail. You had other cases of price squeeze. You had the Telia Sonera case, which was a similar case, but happening in Sweden. A similar case than the Deutsche Telekom case. So Telia Sonera, the incumbent of Sweden, were committing a price squeeze between the price they were charging to the new entrants in Sweden and the charge that are charged by the to the Swedish customer. Now, what is interesting in that case is that that case was not decided by the European Commission, but by the Swedish Competition Authority. So it was a price squeeze case decided by the Swedish authority. But then what happened is that Telia Sonera went on appeal against the decision of the Swedish Competition Authority before the Swedish Court of Appeal. And what happened is that the Swedish Court of Appeal asked a number of questions to the Court of Justice, because, I don't know if you have seen that mechanism, but when the national judge in Europe have to apply European law and they don't know how to do it, they don't know how to interpret European law, they may ask the help of the Court of Justice, of the European Court of Justice, okay, through what's called preliminary ruling question. And so what happened here is that, and the case, the TeliaSonera case is interesting because the Swedish judge asked 10 very precise questions to the Court of Justice to frame a little bit better how you address the price squeeze issue, because we knew since the Dutch Telecom case that price squeeze is an abuse. But what the Swedish appeal judge wanted to know is what are the exact conditions to condemn a price squeeze. And for instance, when you says that the margin is insufficient to cover the retail costs, which retail cost are we speaking about? Is the retail cost of the dominant company, so TeliaSonera in this case, or is the retail cost of the new entrants, the Swedish new entrants, which are not necessarily the same? And there, I think, interestingly, the court says it normally should be the cost of the dominant company, because this is the one the dominant company knows. The dominant company is not supposed to know the cost of the new entrant, of their competitor. But, says the court, in some cases, if it's impossible to get the retail cost of the dominant company, you may use the retail cost of the entrance. So in a way, the court made an opening, a small opening, but an opening, however, of using the cost of the entrance to determine whether the margin is insufficient. And then another series of issues where whether you need to have limiting factor to condemn a price squeeze. So for instance, you know, the TeliaSonera was saying you can only condemn me of price squeeze if I control an essential facility. And the Swedish authority has not proved that I was controlling an essential facility. Or, says TeliaSonera, you can only condemn me if I have a double dominance. So a dominance on the wholesale market, on the network market, but also a dominance on the retail market, on the customer market. And, you know, TeliaSonera came up with a number of possible limiting factors, and the Swedish judges asked to the Court of Justice whether those are indeed limiting factor. And what is interesting is that the court says none of them are a necessary condition to condemn the price squeeze. So the court says, of course, they are interesting in analyzing the case, of course, but you don't need to control an essential facility, or you don't need to be dominant on the retail and the wholesale market to be condemned for a price squeeze. Okay, so very interesting case, because again, like in Deutsche Telekom, the Court of Justice of the European Union tried to make the life of the antitrust agency easier. Now, it doesn't mean that it is easy, but it's easier than in the US, for instance, or it's easier that if all those factors would have been considered as a necessary condition. Okay. So I think also this case is interesting to read, and again, it is mentioned in my paper. So if you want to get the reference. So the last type of abuse is a refusal to deal. And here we have an example in Poland with Orange Polska, who was the Polish incumbent, which has been bought by Orange. So this is why it's called Orange Polska. And what happened there is that Orange Polska was really playing trick to not rent its line to the competitor of Orange Polska. So again, you know, like in every country, you have some new entrants went to enter, but they didn't have their own network, so they had to rent the network of the incumbent. And what happened here, it's a kind of what's called a constructive refusal to deal. So the Orange Polska didn't say, no, you cannot enter. And they didn't say no because they knew that it will not be possible because there was a regulation. But what they did is try to play some trick to make the access more complicated. So, for instance, and it's very interesting to read the Commission decision, because the Commission decision is nearly a copy-paste of the complaint of the new entrants. And it's really, you know, the guide of how you can make the life of your competitor more difficult. So, for instance, Orange Polska was saying we're delaying negotiations. So they say, okay, first you have to meet the engineer, but no luck for you. The engineer is on holiday for the next 2 weeks. Okay, and when the engineer come back, you say, you have to meet the economist, but the economist just left from holidays for 1 month. You know, so you have to come back in 1 month, and then the lawyer is on holidays and everything. So, you know, the thing is that they were trying to use, and really it's an interesting, let's say, guidebook of what to do to make the life of your competitor miserable in telecom. But that's really what the case was about, you know. So a relatively, I would say, relatively simple case legally, very much based on fact. The only question, one of the interesting questions which was raised is that next to the competition law condemnation by the Commission, you also had the Polish regulator which intervened in the case, because there is an obligation to give access under EU regulation and under EU telecom, under Polish telecom law. And so there was an issue of ne bis in idem, in the sense that Orange Polska had been condemned by the Polish regulator, but with a very, very small fine. And so that's why they didn't really care. And they continued to constructively refuse to give access. But so the question is whether the fact that you have been condemned once by your regulatory authority, can you condemn a second time for not the same behavior, but a similar behavior under antitrust? And there the Commission say yes, because competition law and regulation have a different objectives. And as you may know, the condition for the ne bis in idem, so you cannot re-condemn someone for the same behavior, are extremely restrictive. And so in this case, they were not applicable. So, I mean, there was some appeal before the General Court and the Court of Justice, but again, I mean, the Commission won that appeal. And then the last case at the European level is the Slovak Telecom case. So this is a mix of price squeeze and constructive refusal to deal. No, Slovak Telecom is a subsidiary of Deutsche Telekom, and so this is why the Commission condemned, in fact, imposed 2 fines. One fine against Slovak Telecom and another fine specifically against Deutsche Telekom, because Deutsche Telekom is probably the best client of DG Competition, in the sense that they have been condemned several times. Okay, and so there was a kind of recidivism in the case, and this is why the Deutsche Telekom was condemned as the parent company of Slovak Telecom, but also as a recidivist. Okay. Now, this case is raising a number of interesting issues regarding parental liability, for instance, and the case has been decided by the Court of Justice in March last year. And again, basically, the Court of Justice has confirmed, for the most part, the Commission decision. What is interesting in the case is that, and in particular in the Court of Justice case of last year, is that the court says when you have an obligation to deal, and in this case, Slovak Telecom had an obligation to deal because telecom regulation was imposing Slovak Telecom to give access. So when you have an obligation to deal, and so the problem is not a naked refusal, but a constructive refusal to deal, the essential facilities condition do not apply. Okay, so in a way, what is interesting is in Slovak Telecom and going beyond telecom is that the Court of Justice tried to narrow down the essential facilities and the Bronner condition, which are, as we know, extremely complicated to meet, and says, I mean, if you have a constructive refusal to deal, you don't need to apply the essential facilities condition You only to apply, so you don't need to be proved to be a kind of a super dominant player. It suffices to be a dominant player. Okay, so this is why I think this court is this case, sorry, is interesting. Okay. So do you have some question on those abuse of dominant cases or remark? No? So let me go to the, let's say, other part of antitrust. So one is abuse of dominant position, and the other one is cartel. Now, and there is someone from Brazil here, so maybe I don't know if you have Beatrice, if you dealt with that case, but this is a very, very funny case in a way, you know, because what happened there is that in the context of a Brazilian operation, where between Telefónica and Portugal Telecom, so in a way, Portugal Telecom sold their share in the Brazilian mobile operator Vivo to Telefónica, because at the time, you know, Portugal Telecom was in a very difficult financial situation. So in this context of Brazilian operation, they had this funny clause, which were saying, to the extent permitted by law, each party, so Portugal Telecom and Telefónica, will not compete in Europe in the Iberian market. Now, this is really crazy because, I mean, this is really a naked cartel, you know? And so, of course, they took the precaution to say to the extent permitted by law, but nothing is permitted by law, you know, in that context. So what happened is that the European Commission saw that clause and says, I mean, this is an obvious cartel case, and so they condemned it. Now, the clause was not active a long time because the Commission see it very quickly, but they fined it for 80 million euros, so not negligible. So I don't know who was the lawyers involved in that case, but I hope it has been, or she has been fired, because, and this is really crazy to write this kind of clause in a contract. Anyway, so condemnation in 2013, and that has also been confirmed by the Court of Justice in 2017. Now, it's a kind of a funny case, so I don't think it tells us a lot about the law, but just I wanted to mention. Another case which is more interesting at the legal level is this Dutch mobile case. Now, it's interesting because it's one of the cases where the Court of Justice was giving an interpretation of what concerted practices is. Now, if you remember the module of Article 101, you know, there are the Article 101 is condemning agreement between firms, but also concerted practices between firms. You know, and the term concerted practices, I mean, agreement, we can know what it is, but concerted practices is not defined in the treaty. You know, and so the question is, it's up for interpretation, and as always in Europe, it is the Court of Justice which gives the final interpretation of the term that you find in the treaty. And this case, the T-Mobile Netherlands case, gave a very extensive view of this concept of concerted practices. Because what was happening in that case, at the time you had, I believe 6, I don't remember, it was 5 or 6 mobile operator in the Netherlands. So you had a lot of mobile operator. And now, since then, there has been a consolidation wave and there are only 3, but at the time there were 6 or 5 or 6. And what happened is that some high-level people in those companies exchange confidential information on how much they were giving to independent dealers to incentivize those independent dealers to sell them SIM cards. So, you know, if you buy a SIM card, you have 2 ways. Either you go to a T-Mobile shop, or you go to a Vodafone shop, or you go to the KPN shop, and you can only buy the SIM card of that company. But next to those brand shop, you have branded shop. You have also some shop which are unbranded and which are selling the SIM of the SIM card of every mobile operator. Okay, those are called independent retail. And of course, the telecom company, the mobile company, have an interest that those independent retailers promote their own SIM card over the others. Okay, and so one way to do that is to give them a higher commission fee on the selling of their SIM card. You know, so you could have a kind of competition on the commission fee that the mobile operator are giving to the independent retailer. And what happened is that because they discussed that, they limit this competition. And so the Dutch Competition Authority considered that this only exchange of information, so they didn't sign an agreement. They didn't say, okay, we will give that commission for each independent dealer. They were just discussing that. But it happened that after the discussion, the price, the commission were aligned. So both of all the company were giving the same commission. So the Dutch Competition Authority says, okay, this is a concerted practices. Okay, I don't prove an agreement. Maybe there is an agreement, but I cannot manage to prove it, or maybe there is no agreement. But the simple fact that you discuss a confidential information and that you have a kind of price parallelism after it is an indication that it is a concerted practices. Okay, so condemnation. The mobile operator, as you can imagine, are not happy about that, so they go on appeal before Dutch Court of Appeal. And then what happened is that the Dutch judges, like in the Teleson era, are asking some question to the Court of Justice to say, okay, but what is exactly concerted practices? And in that case, the Court of Justice gave that definition, which is a very extensive, I think, definition of concerted practices, is any form of coordination, says the court, between undertaking which, without having reached the stage of an agreement, knowingly substitute practical cooperation between them for the risk of competition. Okay. And so, given that extensive view of concerted practices, the Dutch Court of Appeal considered that indeed there has been a violation of Article 101, and therefore confirmed the condemnation of the different mobile operator for that exchange of confidential information. Okay, so you know, with such an extensive view of concerted practices, be careful of any confidential information that you share with competitors. That's the main message, I think, of this T-Mobile Netherlands case. Okay. Right. So what I suggest is we do a kind of a 10-minute break, a bit longer than the one before, and so we start again at 4:10 for the rest. So is that okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. See you in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I suggest we slowly come back. So when you are back, you just open your camera so I know if everyone is back or no. And I will just wait for you, of course. In the meanwhile, I will share the slide again. So the last part of the application of Article 101 in the telecom, and probably the part which has led to the most of the cases in the past and still now, is the issue of network sharing. Now, and that is specifically applicable for mobile operators. But you know, in order to speed up the deployment of mobile technology, and as we know, every 10 years we have a new technology, so some part of the equipment needs to be changed. For instance, in the antenna, you know, you have those receptors that often needs to be changed when there is a new technology, or sometimes you have to put more antennas for a new technology. So in order to speed up that, sometimes the mobile operators decide, or some of them decide to join their force together and says, we will share networks. So instead of, for instance, if you have 4 mobile operator having 4 towers next to each other, you say, okay, 2 of them says, okay, we will only buy 1 tower and we will share it. And we will either put the same equipment of each, or each of us will put a different equipment. So that's the idea, you know. Now, the network sharing, so the idea that a different operator, 2 or 3 operators, mobile operator, share their network, may have positive and negative effects, as always in life. The positive effect, of course, is that it is reducing cost and risk, and therefore it can speed up the deployment. The other advantage is that you reduce the environmental impact. Instead of having 4 towers next to each other, you may have only 1 or 2, you know. So that's the positive aspect. But of course, there are negative aspects, because if some operators are sharing networks, they are also sharing information, and so they may reduce the competition between them, you know. So for instance, let's suppose that you have 4 mobile network operators, so 4 operators with a mobile license, but 2 or 3 of them share network. You can imagine that between the 2 or the 3, the competition will be a little bit reduced, and so you end up with less competition on the market. And so the whole point is to allow network sharing where the positive effect are less than the negative effect, and prohibit them in the other situation. Okay, and so to consider that if the positive effects are higher than the negative effect, it is not an anti-competitive agreement, so you cannot, let's say, prohibit it under 101. And if the positive effects are less than the negative effect, it is an anti-competitive agreement. Now, what is interesting is that the telecom regulation has been revised. I will mention that later several times, but the last revision was in 2018 with the adoption of what is called the European Electronic Communication Code. So this is the most updated telecommunication law, and that is that law push for network sharing. So, you know, again, in this objective of favoring the deployment of 5G and very high capacity network, the EU lawmaker says, okay, it's important to allow network sharing because this will speed up the deployment of very high capacity network. Okay, so of course antitrust is next to regulation, so it's not necessarily bound by choice, which are made in regulation, but it cannot ignore it completely. Okay. Now, the first case that we had of network sharing, which went to the Court of Justice or to the General Court, was in the context of 3G sharing. So that's what those cases were in 2000. And what happened there is that you had T-Mobile, which was the main player, the main telecom player in Germany, and O2, which was the main telecom player in the UK at the time, which decide to share their network, 3G network, in the UK and in Germany. Okay, and so they say, so we will speed up the deployment of 3G network in Germany and in the UK. Now, what is interesting is that the Commission, it was, you know, this was before the decentralization of 2004, and so before the time where you have to self-assess your agreement with regard to 101. Sorry. So before 2004, you had the possibility to ask to the Commission for an exemption and ask whether your agreement was against or not 101. Now, so what happened is that in 2001, I think, T-Mobile and O2 notified their agreement to European Commission and asked them whether it is okay. And the Commission says yes, it doesn't violate Article 101, paragraph 1. Why? Because the agreement was limited to rural area. Because, you know, the Commission says, I agree that in rural area, the business case to deploy 3G is less important, and so it's better that the companies share their forces. But the agreement was not providing to share network in urban area. So in London, in Munich, in Berlin, in Stuttgart, in Liverpool, they were not sharing their network because there, says the Commission, you have sufficient potentiality to have several networks next to each other. And so I will not allow a network sharing. Okay, so basically what the Commission says is in the cities, the positive effect of the network sharing are not the negative effect of network sharing in terms of reducing competition are not compensated by the positive effect. But in rural area, this is the case. And so this is why, yes, you can share in rural area, no, you cannot share in the cities. And this is what the T-Mobile and O2 had done, and this is why the agreement was considered as okay. Okay. Now we still have a case which is a very long dragging case, because, you know, the problem is that you still have at the European Commission in DG COM a unit in charge of telecommunication issue, but there is no more telecom case. So, you know, you have the impression that sometimes they maintain, there is only one case, which is this one, network sharing in the Czech Republic, which dragged forever. But, you know, I think that because you have those people working on telecom, and so they have to do something, and it's the only case they have more. So what happened there is that between, again, the two main O2 or the O2, which has been then bought by others and so on, and T-Mobile. So, you know, this kind of cooperation which started in 2000 between T-Mobile and O2 team have continued over the countries and over the year. What happened there is that in the Czech Republic, they decide to share the network, but for all the generations. So 2G, 3G, 4G, not the 5G. So only the older generation except the 5G. And there, the Commission was, so it's a 2011 agreement, so more than 10 years ago. No? And the Commission was not very convinced that, I mean, the Commission thought that it goes a bit too far, in the sense that you have several players, so you have 3 players involved, in fact, O2, so Cetin and T-Mobile. And they cover 70% of the market share, and also they were covering the whole Czech Republic except the 2 biggest cities. So for the Commission, it was a little bit too much. Okay, and so first they want to condemn this agreement, and finally now they are in a negotiation with the company to impose remedies. So they say yes, you could do it, but you should limit the information sharing between the company involved in the network sharing agreement to be sure that a competition will be maintained among the 3 operators involved in the network sharing agreement. Okay, so the case is still not yet closed, but clearly I think it will end up with some remedies which will be accepted by the Commission, and so no condemnation. And then the last case, which is interesting because it's related to the 5G, and that was in Italy, and that is a case which is a bit particular because it was a case decided in the margin of a merger decision. So it was not analyzed as a one-on-one case, but because it was part of a full function joint venture, it was analyzed under the merger regulation. And what happened there is that Telecom Italia and Vodafone wanted to share the 5G network sharing, and it was really limited to really the rural area. So it was not covering the densely and highly populated cities. But you know, it's not like in the Czech case, or you just excluded 2 biggest cities of Italy. You know, in fact, it was much more limited in terms of geography. In Italy, it was really focusing on the very strong rural area. And so this is why the Commission validated, if you want, that kind of network sharing, but always with the same kind of logic. You know, if you are in a hard rural area, okay. If you are in cities, that's not okay. Okay. So basically, we have a number of cases at the European level. There is a lot of cases also at the national level on network sharing agreement. And this is still an important issue. And you know, the Commission is about to revise the horizontal agreement guidelines. As you know, in the context of the general antitrust, there is these guidelines on horizontal agreement, and the question is whether and how far the European Commission will have some paragraph on telecom network sharing in that in those guidelines. Okay. So have you some question on the application of Article 101 before I go to the last part of competition law, which is merger control? No. So if not, let me go to the merger control. And there, I mean, the paper, the background paper, which is interesting there, is the paper by Langenheim and 2 of his colleagues at Cleary Gottlieb, which I think is a good summary of the evolution of the practice of the Commission regarding mobile merger. So I will mention that relatively rapidly here, but I mean, the paper is, I think, is very clear in explaining the tendency, and also has a kind of a critical look. And then in the Lear study that I was mentioning at the beginning for DG Comp, so the consultancy study for DG Comp, they analyze specifically the effect of one merger. So they do, as I was telling you, some ex-post analysis. They do an ex-post analysis of the Telecom Polska case, the 102 case that I was mentioning before, but they also do an analysis, an ex-post analysis of one of the telecom merger, the one which happens in Germany. So if you are interested by those issues, go to those two papers. No, in fact, there was, if you look at the merger trends over the last 10 to 15 years, let's say, in telecommunication sectors, you see two main mergers, two main trends. One is in mobile specifically, and this is a concentration of the mobile industry. So as I was telling you, at some point you had in some country 6 MNO, mobile network operators. So I'm not even talking about the MVN. That is not anymore the case. You know, that was clearly too many. And so now you seems to have a kind of an equilibrium around 4 or mostly 3 players. So if you look at most of the European countries now, they tend to have 3 or sometimes 4 mobile network operators, but not 5 or 6, not neither 1 or 2, because that's of course too little. But you know, it seems to be a kind of an equilibrium around 4 or 3. And the big question is, when you have a 4-to-3 merger, will the Commission allow that or not? That's really the critical question. Now, the other tendency was in cable industry. There, first you had a consolidation, because you know what is interesting is that cable, very often they were developed by local authority for television. You know? So some country didn't have cable at all, but the country which had cable, like Germany, like Belgium, Austria, and so on, the Netherlands, they were mostly developed by local authorities. And so the scope of the cable were local or regional, while the scope of the telecom network historically has always been national. Okay, so the first thing which was happening is that it was a consolidation of cable, and Liberty Global, who was and still is an American company, understood the potential of cable consolidation, and they bought several local cable company to make a big group in Europe. But then the second step, so the first step was consolidating cable industry instead of having local operation. And then the second step was this convergence between mobile and cable. And Vodafone in particular has been extremely instrumental in buying a lot of those cable companies across Europe. Okay, so Liberty made the consolidation, and then Vodafone in the second stage bought a lot of those companies from cable company from Liberty, in fact. And Liberty had in the meanwhile make a big premium because they wanted to have these integrated offers, fixed and mobile, and because, as I was mentioning before, Vodafone need a kind of fixed infrastructure to improve its mobile operation. Okay, so those are, let's say, the main tendency that you see on the market, and the question is how the Commission reacted to that in its merger control. So I will first focus on mobile, and then go to cable. Okay. So in mobile, and here I will be relatively quick. So if you have some questions, don't hesitate. But again, I mean, there is this paper of Langenheim, which is in Concurrence, which is summarizing all of that very, very well. You had, I would say, 4 phases of Commission analysis. Okay, and I am mostly talking about the 4-to-3 merger because those are the ones which have been the most critical in the legal analysis. So the first merger that you had, the first 4-to-3 merger that the Commission had to analyze was in Austria already nearly 10 years ago. So in December 2012. And what happened there is that you had 4 players: Telekom Austria, T-Mobile, Orange, and Hutchison, H3G. And you had 4 mobile operators, and then the number 3 and the number 4 wanted to merge. In fact, it was Hutchison, who is an Asian group, who wanted to buy the number. So the number 4, which was a kind of a maverick, wanted to buy the number 3, Orange. And the Commission says, yes, you can do that. So it allows the merger, recognizing that it will decrease the competitive pressure, in particular because the maverick maybe would not be a maverick anymore because they will be bigger. But they say, what I wanted to have, instead of a 4 MNO, because there will be only 3 MNO, I wanted to have more MVNO, because the MVNO, the mobile virtual network operator, may exercise a competitive pressure that are lost because of the loss of 1 MNO. Okay, and so what the Commission says, yes, you can do it, but with remedy. In particular, you have to divest some spectrum, and you have to allow a number of MVNO, 16 MVNO, on your network. And it was a form of pay-as-you-go MVNO. So the idea is that the MVNO will rent the line, but not, you know, at the beginning, not like when you rent an apartment and you say, okay, I pay X rent every month, even if I am not in the apartment because I am on holiday or elsewhere. So pay as you go is a bit more like the hotel, you know, you only pay when you use the network. Okay, and so that was the deal, and some MVNO, in particular Liberty, which had a lot of cable but no mobile. And because of this bundle offer, Liberty wanted to have mobile in their offer. They were renting the network of the merged company Hutchison and Orange. Okay, but you know, after some years, we realized that this remedy didn't work so well, in fact, because the price in Austria, the mobile subscription have increased. So, you know, the Commission says, well, maybe this remedy don't work so well. And so the second stage of the analysis was against MVNO, but another type of MVNO, a form of capacity-based MVNO. So instead of paying as you go, paying as you use, like an hotel, you pay at the beginning of the year a certain amount independently of what you consume. The idea being that if you do that, the MVNO will be more incentivized to use the network, because, you know, as they have paid at the beginning of the year a certain amount, they have an interest to recoup as much as possible that certain amount. And so the idea of the Commission was that a capacity-based MVNO will be more aggressive than a pay-as-you-go MVNO. Okay, and so what happened in two decisions, one decision in Ireland and another decision in Germany. The Commission in Ireland, so it was against Hutchison, the number 4, buying in this case O2, the number 2, and in Germany it was Telefonica Deutschland, so the number 3, which bought the number 4, E+. But basically, in the two cases, you had the same thing, a 4-to-3 merger. And what happened is that the Commission says you can do that, provide that the merging entity accept a capacity-based MVNO on their network. Okay. Now there was a lot of other things more technical, but I will not go in that now. Again, you can go to the paper if you want. But so basically, the Commission says, okay, I hope that work better. Does it work? Clearly better than before, but not enough, according to the Commission. And so this is why the last period, or the third period, is to say, no, I don't think that MVNO can be as good as an MNO. And therefore, I will prohibit the merger unless a fourth MNO appears on the market directly. So for instance, in Telias Telenor, the Commission says, I will prohibit it, so the party removed the merger. In Hutchison UK, the Commission prohibit the merger. And Hutchison Italy, what happened is that a third players arrive on the market. So Wind, so Hutchison, it was always the same kind of configuration. You know, you had Hutchison, usually the fourth player, buying the second or the third player. So in this case, Hutchison buying Wind. And then what happened is that it was authorized, provide a fourth player will arrive on the market, and that was while Free arrived in Italy. Okay. So what is interesting is that as you can see over the 3 periods, the Commission became more and more aggressive in its merger analysis, you know, because before it was allowing and pay as you go MVNO, then it went to a capacity-based MVNO, and then it required a fourth MNO. Now, the question is, what will happen now? Because the decision of the Commission in Hutchison UK has been annulled by the Commission, by the General Court 2 years ago, in May 2020. So basically what the General Court said is that the analysis of the Commission is not good enough. And on the basis of what I read, says the General Court, I don't think that the Commission could have prohibited the merger. Now, this court case is very much discussed, and many commentators think that the court is not good. And so what happened is too strict against the Commission. And so what happened is that the Commission went on appeal of the General Court decision before the Court of Justice. So we have to wait now the Court of Justice decision to see whether indeed the Commission in the UK case was too strict or not, because this is the position of the General Court. But we have to see whether the Court of Justice will follow it. And I'm not sure at all that the Court of Justice will follow it. But in the meanwhile, and until we have this court case, there is a kind of uncertainty whether a 4-to-3 merger will be allowed or not. Okay, so that's a bit of the difficulty. Now, we had a case in the Netherlands, however, after the Italian and the English case, the British case, of a 4-to-3 merger, which has been allowed by the Commission. So it's not that the Commission will always prohibit a 4-to-3 merger, no. But it has been allowed in a very particular circumstances because it was a kind of failing firm defense. So in a sense, what happened is that T-Mobile decided to buy Tele2 Netherlands, but Tele2 Netherlands was nearly bankrupt. So basically the Commission says, with or without the merger, anyway, we will end up with 3 players. So why not allowing the merger? You know, so many people don't know what you can read in this Dutch case, because is it because the Commission is becoming more lax than before, and a sort of inflection point from its increasing severity over the last 10 years, or is it because the fact of the Dutch case was very particular, and you had a failing firm defense? But in any case, I think until we don't have the court decision in Hutchison, UK, which is called, in fact, the CK Telecom, because in fact, behind Hutchison, you had a financial company which was called CK Telecom, and they were says that they made loss because of that. And so before we have the court decision in CK Telecom, I think it would be very complicated to know exactly, if you are working in a company or in a law firm, to advise exactly whether a 4-to-3 merger will be accepted by the European Commission or not. Okay, so there is unfortunately a kind of high uncertainty there. Now, the big trend, as I said, was the cable consolidation. Now, the situation of cable consolidation was very different from the situation of mobile consolidation, because mobile consolidation, what you had is a number of national players which were competing nationally, which merged together. So clearly, this is a decrease of competition. Okay. While in the cable case, it was very different. You had only regional players which were consolidating together. So they were not competing. So for instance, in Liberty Ziggo, which is an in-country geographical consolidation of cable in the Netherlands, you know, you had Liberty, which was on one part of the Netherlands in the north. I don't remember if it was in the north, in the south, but whatever. I mean, let's say that Liberty was in the north, Ziggo was in the south, and they were merging. But there you don't really reduce competition, because, you know, the cable in the north were not really, the cable in Groningen were not competing with the cable in Amsterdam, you know, so there was not really the same kind of problem. So this kind of consolidation in general was not too much problematic, and clearly less problematic than what you had in the cable consolidation, in the mobile consolidation. Okay. Now, however, the Liberty Ziggo case is a kind of a long saga, because what the Commission was afraid is that the cable also very often they have some media activities. Okay, so they not only have an infrastructure, but they also own some PTV channel or even sometimes some program production. And so the Commission was a little bit worried that this vertical integration between media and cable will make the life of the other infrastructure players which do not have content harm more difficult. So for instance, you would have had Liberty Ziggo with some PTV, and you would have had competing with Liberty Ziggo KPN, so the telecom players, without any pay TV. And so the risk, of course, is that Liberty Ziggo would say, okay, if you want to get some PTV channel like Film 1, Film 1, which is a very popular, which was at least a very popular channel in the Netherlands at the time, you have to go on my cable, and you cannot get your internet through KPN. Okay, and so because of that risk of vertical integration, which would make the life of the company which were not vertically integrated more difficult, the Commission imposed some obligation to be sure that some of the media activities will be limited. No, KPN was not thought that it was not enough, and so it went to the General Court, and it got the annulment of the decision in 2017. And so the Commission had to redo the analysis. It redo the analysis in 2018. It reconfirmed that the merger could be analyzed. Again, KPN went to the Court of Justice, to the General Court, saying it could not have been authorized. But finally, that case were lost last year. So, you know, this case led to more than 10 years of procedures. But at the end of the day, the consolidation has been confirmed with the remedy that have been imposed at the time. Now, the second thing was the second, let's say, stage in cable. So first it was the integration, and then the second stage was the consolidation, or at least the fact that the cable had been brought by the mobile operators. And there, it was less problematic because mobile and cable were not seen as substitute products, and therefore competing with each other, but more as complementary products. So Vodafone bought Cable and Wireless in the UK, bought Cable Deutschland in Germany, bought Ono in Portugal and or in Spain, I don't remember. And so every time it was accepted without any remedy, because it was seen at the time, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, as complementary product and not substitute product. But then what happened is that as the convergence between mobile and fixed became more and more important, and the consumer were tend to buy bundled products, the Commission says, well, they are not anymore so substitute. You know, we could also say that there is a kind of, they are not anymore just complementary products, because the consumer are buying fixed and mobile together. So we have no competition on bundled offer. And so therefore you could not consider that cable is in one market and mobile is in another market. And so when Vodafone continues its shopping with Liberty in the Netherlands, and then Vodafone some years ago did a big acquisition of all the Liberty cable in Germany, in Czech Republic, in Hungary, and in Romania. There was a huge acquisition by Vodafone, and that's when Liberty left a big part of the European territory. The Commission says, yes, you can do it, but with some remedy. Now, again, we may discuss the remedy in detail if you want, but I think the only thing I wanted to show you is the kind of the direction of travel of the Commission. You know, in the first stage, the Commission was very lenient because it says cable and mobile are in different markets. And then in a second stage, when bundling started to pick up, the Commission became a bit more restrictive and imposed some remedy. So, you know, the increasing severity of the Commission over the time that you have seen in the mobile consolidation, the 4-to-3 mobile consolidation, you see here as well in the context of cable mobile integration. You know, so clearly over the years, the Commission has become more and more severe in its merger analysis in telecom in general. Okay. And then the last, let's say, interesting analysis where when the cable operators buy media operation. So as I said, sometimes they have already some media operation. That was the case in the Netherlands, in the Liberty Ziggo case. And that was why the Commission imposed some remedies in the Liberty Ziggo case. But what happened in Belgium, in the Liberty, the Vijver Media case, is that Liberty, who owned Telenet, the mobile and cable operator, didn't have any media. But they realized that most of the people, most of the Belgian customers, buy a bundled product, fixed, mobile, and television. And in fact, in general, the premium product is television. You know, the people will decide which operator they will buy according to the channel they can find or the football sport they can find. You know, so this is why some of the cable operators want to have good content, and so Liberty bought the Vijver Media, which is a very good, which has a lot of very good TV channel in Flanders. And so, like in Liberty Ziggo, the Commission was a little bit concerned that with this vertical integration infrastructure, cable infrastructure, and media, some premium pay TV channel, the vertical group, Liberty de Vijver Media, will make the life of Proximus, which was the main competitor of Liberty in the Flanders, more difficult. And so what happened is that the Commission says, yes, you can merge, so Liberty can buy the Vijver Media, but it needs to be sure that the very good PTV channel that the Vijver Media has could also be shown on the Proximus infrastructure and will not be reserved for the Liberty infrastructure. Okay. So you see, this is a classical, I would say, case of vertical integration when you wanted to be sure that this vertical integration, when a vertical integrated company compete with a non-vertical integrated company, that there is no vertical foreclosure. Okay, so it's a classical example of a vertical foreclosure, but apply in the telecom sector. Okay. So to summarize, let's say, or to recall the main point of the analysis of the antitrust analysis in telecom. You know, if we take the market power assessment, the main thing is for market definition, you use the traditional tool, so the SNP test, but taking into account the characteristic of the network industries, and in particular, that there is two families of market, the retail markets downstream and the upstream market upstream. Sorry, the retail market and the wholesale market upstream, okay? And in the wholesale market, you have this distinction between access and termination. Dominant position, you still find a lot of single dominant position, in particular in the fixed, because some market share remain very high and the barrier to entry are very high. In the mobile, it's less the case, but in the mobile, what you can have sometimes is collective dominance. Okay. In terms of ex post antitrust action, so 101 and 102, you had a lot of action at the beginning of liberalization and also a lot of action regarding excessive price, which is quite exceptional in general. and some action regarding exclusionary abuse, in particular price squeeze. Today, there is much less case at the European level. As I told you, there is nearly no cases anymore at the Commission, because on the one hand, most of the problems are solved or are dealt with regulation, that we will discuss in a minute. And on the other hand, the national competition authority have taken more role since the decentralization in 2004. And so you still have several cases at the national. So the point is not to say that antitrust has disappeared from telecom sectors, but it's more than most of it is dealt at the national level. And then in terms of merger, what I have tried to do here is try to distinguish between in-service merger. So for instance, the mobile consolidation and cross-service merger. So for instance, cable and mobile, or cable and media. And then the in-country merger. So whether it's the merger within one country or the cross-border merger. Whether it is across country or across region, if you are talking about cable. Okay, and I think, as you can imagine, the Commission has been the strictest for in-service and in-country merger, and has become more and more strict. While, of course, if it is cross-service and cross-border, there is more complementarity issue than substitutability issue, and this is why it has been approved more often. Okay, so not only that you could see a kind of increasing severity of the Commission over the years, but also you should see that it was depending on the context. And of course, if it is in-service, in-country merger, it's much more, the Commission was much more strict than if it is cross-service or cross-border merger. Okay. Voilà. So this is what I wanted to tell you for the antitrust part. Do you have, before we do the small break, and then we will go to the regulatory part, and I will be briefer there. Do you have some question or remark? So I'm sorry, I guess it's a lot of information on a Friday afternoon, so I'm sorry for that. And also through Zoom is probably not the best way to convey the information. But again, I mean, my idea is to give you, the broad picture, because I think it's important that you have that broad picture. And if you want to go further on some specific case, on some specific issue, there is those background reading, and those background reading themselves have some reference. So you can go further if you want. So, I mean, if there is one little nuances that you don't have understand, don't hesitate to ask, but also really the objective is that you have the broad pictures here, and that you can navigate, let's say, you can understand the big tendencies that you have in the telecom sectors.
I have a quick question, just in relation to national cases becoming more prevalent. Can you just elaborate on the reasons for that?
Yes.
Since 2004.
So what happened in antitrust in general, so not only in telecom, is that in 2004 there was a big movement from the Commission to decentralize the enforcement of competition law towards national competition authority, because 2004 was the time where there was this big enlargement of the European Union to the east. So before the European Union, you had 15 member states, and then in May 2004, you had 10 new member states. Some very big, like Poland, others smaller, or other very small, like Malta. But still, I mean, you had 10 more countries, and so the Commission was a little bit concerned that they won't be able to do the job alone. And so what they say is that first, we should have in every country a national competition authority, which was not the case before. And those national competition authorities should take more tasks. And so since then, indeed, so this is more than nearly 20 years, and those national competition authorities have increased in power, in expertise, in money, And so they have taken more and more case in every sector, but also in telecom case. And so this is why the role of the Commission has become less prevalent. I would say the Commission is mainly there for the very big case, and also for the, if you have new theory of harm, to, let's say, to lead the way of what the national competition authority should do. Okay. And I think if you go to the Lear report, so this consultancy report, you see that very well. So there is a first chapter on the evolution of antitrust enforcement in telecom, and you could see that there has been over the year a shift from the Commission to the National Competition Authority. So again, if you want to have some statistics and so on, you can go to that report. Okay, so if there is no other question, I suggest we do again a 5-minute break, and then we do the last hour with the regulation. Okay, so I suggest we start again. So again, when you are ready, you put your camera on, so I know what I can start. Okay, so the last part of this presentation, and sorry, it's part 3 and not part 2, and that is about the regulation. So next to antitrust, which is clearly applicable to telecom like in every other sector, and with a relatively narrow regulated conduct defense, as we discussed in with the Dutch telecom case, there is a very important regulatory regime which complement antitrust. So there is a paper that I've written with a colleague which tried to summarize the very long electronic European communication code. So we have tried in that paper to follow on the to focus on the main element. And in this presentation, I will follow the same, let's say, structure of that chapter, that book chapter, which is more or less also the structure of the directive itself. So basically, there are three main European law which are important if you want to understand, if you want to find out, sorry, where is the EU regulatory framework for telecommunication. The main one is this directive of 2018, which is establishing a European electronic communication code. So formally, it is a directive, but in practice, it is referred to the code for telecom. And then you have another regulation, which is setting up BEREC, the body of the European regulatory authorities, and that is let's say the club of the 27 national telecom authority, which are together within BEREC. And then you have a specific regulation for the net neutrality. So the net neutrality rule are not in the directive of 2008 because they did previously and it was not integrated into the directive. This is a regulation of 2015, which is called the Open Internet Regulation. Okay, so this is basically the three. There are others, but those are, let's say, the three main law that are important. And the first and the longest one is this first one, the code itself. Okay. So also the structure I wanted to present to you is what are the scope, the objective, and the principle of the law. Then what are the institutional design? Then the three main part of regulation, which is entry regulation, who can enter in the market and at which condition. Then economic regulation, which basically complement antitrust to correct market failure and to regulate the operator, the telecom operator, which have a significant market power. But basically, those are the dominant operator, as I was mentioning before. And then, even if the market is functioning perfectly, you may have a need of social regulation, because, for instance, in some area, there is no business case to build a high connectivity networks. And so you need to have universal service provision, which will complement the economic regulation. Okay, so those are, let's say, the structure of the code. So in terms of scope, what is very important is to distinguish, let's say, the infrastructural part. So the fixed infrastructure, the mobile infrastructure, even the satellite infrastructure. We have seen in the war of Ukraine how satellite infrastructure are absolutely key. Those are covered by the European Electronic Communication Code. However, everything which is running over that infrastructure, so the digital services, are not covered by the code. they are covered by a new law, and you may have seen if you follow the issue that the European Union has agreed last month a very important new law, which is called the Digital Market Act, which will regulate the big tech. And then last week, another new law, which is called the Digital Services Act, which will mostly regulate content moderation. So it's not that those digital services are unregulated, but they are regulated by other piece of law than the Electronic Communication Code. So the Electronic Communication Code is really about digital network and then internet access services. So the door to internet. But then what is happening on internet, this is not regulated by the code. Now, formally, and you will see that in the paper, formally they are electronic communication network and electronic communication services which are regulated, and in the services we have the internet access services, so this is the internet subscription. We have the what's called the interpersonal communication services, which can be number based, so that's the old telephony if you want, or which can be a number independent, so for instance a Skype call would be regulated as well. And then you have the convenience optional machine to machine or broadcasting, but again only the infrastructural part is covered by the code. Now, the objective of the code there are four. If you go to Article 3 of the code, you see the four objectives: connectivity, and as I told you, this is in fact the most important one today. Effective competition, internal market, so the European market, and the interest of the citizen. Okay, so every action that a national telecommunication operator is taking against a telecom player, they should show that they are meeting, or they are aimed to meet those objectives. And then in terms of principle for action, so the Article 3 of the code is very important because it set up the objective, but also the principle for regulatory action, which are, traditional, and you will see that also in the other module of this course, of this course. You find the same kind of principle in energy regulation, in railway regulations, and everywhere. So I wouldn't say that telecom is particular, but probably telecom is one of the most explicit regime about objectives and principles. So principles is a regulatory predictability, and this is very important, because those telecom companies, they are doing investment for 50 years or more. The fiber which is now being put in the street, it is there for 15 years or 1 century. So it's important that they know now how they will be regulated over the lifetime of the infrastructure. Non-discrimination, there is no way to discriminate between telecom, some form of technology over others. And this is very linked also to the technological neutrality principle. So, if you, for instance, read the definition of what is a very high capacity network, it will not tell you it's a fiber network or it's a 5G network. It's technologically neutral. It tells you what you need in terms of capacity on the network, but it doesn't tell you which network it should be. And it may depend, in some region it may be mobile, that's the most effective infrastructure. In some region, maybe even satellite, for instance, in very, very sparsely populated area, it doesn't make any sense to build fiber or even all those mobile tower. Satellite is probably the most effective technology. So, it's very important that the law is neutral to that, and that's allow the best technology, the most effective technology to be deployed. Promotion, investment, and innovation, as I was telling you, innovation is very important in that sector and has led to much better services over the years. So it's very important that regulation promote that and promote investment also. Adaptability. So regulation should be able also to adapt to change of market structures and technology, and proportionality. Okay, you should not over-regulate. So those are principles which are in the law, and if they are not respected, the company may attack a decision may contest a decision of the national regulatory authorities because they are not respecting those principles. Okay. Second point, in terms of institutional design. Now, here is very important to know, and this is different from what you, for instance, find in the US or in some other jurisdiction. We don't have a European Telecom Authority. So what happened is that we have a kind of what Pierre Larouche, who is a scholar and has studied a lot telecom regulation, called a vertical decision chain model. In the sense that the objective and the principle are defined in EU law and then declined in national law. This is what I just mentioned, this Article 3 of the code. But then the implementation and even the clarification of those principles in specific circumstances are done by the NRA, the national regulatory authorities. Okay, so basically the lawmaker are setting up the direction, and then, but not going into the detail. And then the national regulatory authorities implement that in specific circumstances. Now, this type of legislation, which is very much principle-based, allows, of course, the legislation to be relatively resilient when there is a change of market circumstances and market structure, because the law only contains the principle, and then it's up to the NRA to adapt those principles to the specific circumstances. Okay, so this kind of vertical decision chain model or principle-based legislation is probably a method which is very well adapted to a sector which is changing relatively rapidly. Now, as I was telling you, the cornerstone of the code is the national regulatory authorities. And so in every member state, in the 27 member states of the European Union, you have a national regulatory authority or telecom authority. Now, because they have such an important role in implementing EU law, the EU law and the code, in particular Article 5 to 11 of the code, are very prescriptive of what the member states should set up. You know, it's not just said, okay, member states, you set up your regulatory authority and you do what you want. You know, not at all. And there are a number of requirements that those authorities have to meet to be sure that they will do their job properly. So they should be independent from the market players, obviously, because otherwise there is a clear conflict of interest. But also, and that is maybe more controversial, independent from the state, from the government and from the parliament. A bit like the central bank, you know. Central banks are supposed to be independent because otherwise they could have a kind of a short-term consumer bias, you know. They could have a bias to make the price decreasing very rapidly, but maybe at the expense of long-term investment. So it's very important that a bit like a central bank, like that the regulatory authority are independent from the states. And you see that also in electricity, you see that also in antitrust, by the way. There is more and more this requirement of independence. Now, we still live in a system of liberal democracies in Europe, in most of the European countries, I would say. And so independence doesn't go hand in hand with accountability. So it's not because you are independent that you can do what you want. And so first, the national regulatory authorities have a clear legislative mandate. This is this Article 3 with the principle and objectives. And also, and this is very important, all their decisions can be appealed before a national court. And in fact, very often, more often than not, the telecom operators are appealing the decision against them before national court. And another element which is very important and to, let's say, counterbalance the independence is transparency. So national authorities should be very transparent in what they do and how they end up to make what they are doing. So before every important decision, you should have a public consultation. And to hear the voice of everyone. And then also the result of the that should be public. So for instance, you have the publication of the principle of cost sharing of universal service. So those are examples of transparency. But my point is to say that, you know, the authority, the national regulatory authority, cannot just be a kind of a black box and says, okay, I have decided that and that's it. I mean, they have to be participatory in their process of decision and then explain, justify the choice they are making. Okay. Now, as I told you, the cornerstone is the national authorities, but because there is a clear European dimension in all of that, all those authorities, the 27 authorities, are regrouped into a BEREC, which has been set up by this regulation of 2018. I mean, it exists before, but I mean, there was a kind of adaptation or revision of that regulation, that BEREC regulation. And basically what you have is three things. You have what is called the Board of Regulator, which is composed of 27 persons, the bosses of each national regulatory authority. So each national regulatory authority has one chairwoman or chairman, and those people are meeting every 2-3 months in different cities of Europe to discuss issues of common interest, there are difficulties, how to interpret EU law and all those kind of things. And those decisions by the bosses are prepared by expert working groups, so by people who are not the bosses, but the expert. And then you have also offices, so a secretariat, if you want, which is based in Riga, and which is supporting the work of the Board of Regulator and the working group. Okay, again, more detail in my paper or in the code directly, or in this case in the regulation, the BEREC regulation, if you want to know more. Okay. Now that is for in terms of, you know, the framework, principle, objective, institutional, design. Now the real meat is, yes, okay, but to do what? And what are the rules which are applicable to telecom operators? And here I focus on I have divided the thing in a I mean, I would say a very traditional way, which is the entry regulation, economic regulation, and the social and consumer protection regulation. Okay. Now, the entry regulation, you find it mostly in Article 42 to 58 of the code. And basically the idea, and that was the idea of liberalization, in fact, is to lower as much as possible the legal barriers to entry. So the idea is that it should be possible for everyone to enter the telecommunication space and to offer a telecommunication network or service. Okay. And that is the big shift which was done at the liberalization, because before liberalization, you had only a legal monopoly. So only one player could do it. Now everyone could do it. And so the principle is a principle of what's called a general authorization. General in the sense that everyone can have it, and authorization in the sense that you just have to notify to the regulator that you want to offer a telecom services, because it's important to know who is doing what. But you don't need to have the approval. Provided that you respect the conditions which are in the code, you can offer your service. There are, however, two cases where what's called an individual right, or a form of a license, that's some others call about license, but the EU law speak about individual rights, are necessary. When you want to dig in the street and to put your fiber, you need to have the authorization of the municipality, okay? And to get what's called a right of way, a right to dig in the street and put in the street your infrastructure. So that's one case where you need to have an individual right. And the other case is if you want to be a mobile network operator, an MNO, and you want to have spectrum, you have to buy it from the state. So that is also the other case where you need to have an individual right. So, you know, normally you can provide everything, but if you want to dig in the street and put your fixed infrastructure, or if you want to be an MNO, you need to ask the authorization of the state. Spectrum is in general at the state level, right of way is in general at the municipality level, at the local level, but in both cases, those are public power. Now, with the importance that mobile has taken over time, the value of spectrum has considerably increased over time. You know, before, you know, when you didn't have a lot of mobile services, spectrum was not really useful. I mean, yes, it was useful for broadcasting. You know, you may know that the most extensive user of spectrum are the military. They own, in fact, most of the spectrum in every country. But, you know, before 20 years ago, nobody really cares because, yes, you needed to have a bit of spectrum for broadcasting, for terrestrial broadcasting, but that was it. While now, given the number of multiplication of mobile services, and with Internet of Things, it will increase again, radio spectrum has become a very, very valuable resources, and on which states are making a lot of money. And so the whole question is, what kind of mechanism design, what kind of mechanism you will use to give spectrum, to allocate spectrum and assign spectrum to different companies. And, you know, there is one thing that you should distinguish, and that's a bit technical, but it's important to have that in mind, is the allocation of spectrum and the assignment of spectrum. So allocation of spectrum is to say, and this is in general decided at the world level, is to say, okay, this frequency, so for instance, the 800 megahertz, will be used for mobile service, or will be used for broadcasting service, or will be used for military service. Okay, so the allocation is just to say these services, this frequency will be used for this type of service. And it needs to be decided at the world level, or at least at the regional level, because otherwise you have a risk of interferences. You know, so for instance, if France says, I want to use this frequency band for broadcasting, and Belgium next to it says, I want to use the same frequency band for mobile services, we may have a problem at the border. Okay, so this is why it's very important that this allocation things is coordinated, at least across the country, which are next to each other. Once this step is done, so we know that the 800 megahertz is for mobile services, then comes the second step, which is the assignment, which is to say, okay, this spectrum goes to this telecom company, this mobile company. And that is done by the state, because it is the states which own their own frequencies. Okay, so allocation is which services, and then assignment is which company. Now, the interesting part, because that's where money is made, is in the assignment, because that's where the state says, okay, I will assign, I have that chunk of spectrum, and that I will assign, and I will sell it to some extent. And so the interesting thing is that over time, the process to assign spectrum has been changed. So, you know, when spectrum 20 years ago, when spectrum was not really worth, it was mostly a system of command and control. So in the sense that, okay, the state was saying, okay, is that company which get it, and that's it. And sometimes they were not even required to pay. Over time, more and more market mechanisms have been used, and in particular, some auctions. So now most of the European countries are auctioning the spectrum. And so they say, okay, I have this chunk of spectrum, who is ready to pay the most? And the company which is ready to pay the most get it. Okay, so that's how it works. In some case, there is no need for license to use the spectrum. So for instance, the Wi-Fi spectrum is license exempted. So you don't need to buy the spectrum to use the Wi-Fi. But for the most important spectrum, like the one used for mobile, this is, you have to buy it through an auction process. Okay. So this is for the first part. entry regulation, we try to authorize everyone to enter, but when there is a scarce resources like spectrum or right of way, you need to have the authorization of this. The thing is that even if you can legally enter, it doesn't mean that you have a business case to make money. Because, you know, if you don't have any network and you have to build your own network, you will never make it because it's so costly to build your own network and it takes so much time. So, you know, it's not enough to have entry regulation. You also need to have economic regulation, which mostly aims to help the entrants in their economic case and mostly aim to force the incumbent to rent their network to the entrants. Okay, so that's really the idea, is that economic regulation is there to help entrants and to lower the economic barriers. So entry regulation is there to lower legal barriers. Economic regulation is there to lower economic barriers. Now, the strategy which has been followed by the Commission is to say, and by the European Union is to say, we try to focus regulation on the wholesale market. So basically, we force companies to rent their network. That will attract a number of new entrants. That will create effective competition on the retail market. And therefore, you don't need to regulate the retail prices. You know, so the idea is that by focusing your intervention on the wholesale market, and in particular on the access and termination market, you create enough competition so that you don't need to worry about excessive price at the retail level, because you have competition, which is in general a better regulator than the state. Okay, so that's really the idea. So basically a lot of regulation at the wholesale level and minimal regulation at the retail level. You still have some, though, you still have some regulation at the retail level for international roaming. So for instance, when you use your SIM card from one country and you are traveling in another country, those retail roaming charge that you are paying are regulated, and for international call. But for the rest, you know, most of the regulation is concentrated on the wholesale market. And there is often a distinction which is made in regulatory studies between what's called asymmetric regulation and symmetric regulation. So asymmetric regulation is a regulation which only focusing on the big player, so the one with significant market power or dominance. And in that sense, antitrust is mostly an asymmetric regulation. While symmetric regulation apply to everyone across the board, independently of your size. So for instance, consumer protection apply across the board. I mean, you have the same consumer protection obligation if you are a small or a big company. Okay. And so in telecom, you will find a mix of asymmetric and symmetric regulation. Okay, there are some obligations which apply to every telecom operators, and some obligation which only apply to the big one. Okay, so basically this is a kind of a summary of the regulation at the retail market and the regulation at the wholesale market, and the regulation which is asymmetric only on the big one, and the regulation which is symmetric on the big and small. And what you see is that most of the regulation is asymmetric on the wholesale market. And it's mostly access regulation, so forcing the incumbent to rent their network. You don't really have asymmetric regulation at the retail level, you don't have that anymore. And then in terms of symmetric regulation, as I told you, you still have a little bit on international roaming and international call. And then you have some symmetric regulation at the wholesale level for termination. So when a call is initiated on one network and terminated on another network, this is regulated by the code, and this is independently of your size. And then some access to fixed physical infrastructure, even if you are very small, you are subject to some access of your infrastructure, but that's really not the main thing. So I would say that the main part of the regulation is asymmetric wholesale, but you have other things as well. And if we focus on asymmetric wholesale, that's where, as I was telling you at the beginning of our conversation, that's where the economic regulation has been aligned to some extent to the antitrust law. Because you know how it works in antitrust, you define the market, then you find your dominant position, and then you impose some remedies. In economic regulation, you will define the market in the same way. You will assess the significant market power in the same way than dominance. And this is why I was telling you that this recommendation of the Commission of 2018 on significant market power is a form of sector-specific competition law guidance. But then, you know, the thing is that you will only intervene with economic regulation when competition law is not effective enough. So mostly for access market. For the rest, you leave it to competition law. And then in terms of remedy, it's not ex post, and that's a big difference. And one of the main difference between antitrust and competition law is that antitrust is ex post. So you cure a problem, while competition, and very often, you know, it's too late and the entrance is dead, is bankrupt, while regulation is ex ante. So before you try to prevent the problem instead of curing it. So in a sense, a new entrant could get much quicker access to the network than if you have to wait 5 years of an antitrust investigation, a condemnation, and so on and so forth. Okay. Basically, if you read the code, you will see that the main remedy that a national regulatory authority may impose are mostly behavioral remedies. So basically, it's access obligation, price control, wholesale price control, transparency, and so on. There is a possibility to impose a form of light structural separation, which is called functional separation, which the idea being that that has been applied in the UK, for instance, where more than 10 years ago now, British Telecom, which was the incumbent of the UK, has been divided in two parts. One is the network part, which is called Openreach, and the other one is the retail part, which is called BT Retail. The idea being that Openreach, which is the network part, will behave in a much more independent way than the retail part, and therefore much more non-discriminatory way. Okay, so this functional separation is to ensure that the network part is behaving in a non-discriminatory manner. And this is, by the way, what has been done in energy. As you have seen, or as you will see, it was decided to break up the energy value chain into 4 parts. You know, you have the generation, transmission, the distribution, and then the supply. And those 4 parts have been structurally separated. So in a way, in energy, the separation, structural separation, was much stronger than what has been imposed in telecom. Now, if you have a good economic regulation, if you have a good entry regulation and a good economic regulation, what do you do is that you have the lowest entry barriers at the legal level and at the economic level. But so you try to make the market work as best as it could. But that doesn't mean that it is fair. You know, a market could work extremely efficiently, but be completely unfair. You know, and therefore the states cannot be happy with just the result of an effective market, and wants therefore to complement economic regulation with some form of social regulation, you know. And one form of social regulation that we have in Europe is, and also the other region of the world, is what's called a universal service. The idea being that telecom being such an important service today, because you know you can really not live anymore without a telecom services, without an internet connection. Of course you can, but I mean you are really marginalized if you don't have an internet connection today. So what the universal service aims to achieve is that everyone, everywhere in the country, in cities and in rural area, have access to what's called an adequate, and there is a kind of definition for what adequate is in the code, an adequate broadband internet access. And an adequate is an internet which allows you to have email, to go to social network, to go to the e-administration and all of that. I mean, there is a list of 11 services which should be, let's say, possible on your internet connection in a reasonable time. So not only that it should be there, but it should be there at a price which is affordable. Because of course you can tell you, oh yes, you can have an internet connection, but it will cost you 1,000 euro every month. I mean, that's of course not really feasible for many people. And so therefore, the idea of the universal service is not only that the service should be there, but also it should be at a price which is affordable and of a certain quality. So basically, and this is very nice, every European are entitled to have a universal service. Now, what happens is that maybe the market will not lead to that. Maybe it will. And clearly in cities, given the competition, you may expect that everyone can have an affordable and adequate internet connections. But in rural area, probably not. And so what will happen is that then the states or the national telecom authority will have to designate a company as the universal service provider, which is often the old incumbent. And if the universal service provider says, look, I mean, I am making losses here because I have to give this internet connection at, I don't know, 20 euro a month, while in fact the cost for me of that is 40 euro a month, because there are not many people using it, and it's a very long distance and so on. They may say, okay, there is I'm making a loss there. There is a net cost, and so I need to be compensated. And the state, either from its general budget or from what's called a sector-based fund, a telecom universal service fund, to which every telecom operator have to pay, will have them to compensate the loss that the universal service provider is making. Okay, because it's fair, you know, it's if you are designated to provide the service at a loss, you really need to be compensated by the state. You cannot just say, okay, I do it for because the state asked me for it. Okay. So very important universal policy, which is aimed to ensure that we have an affordable internet connection all over the territory. The other main thing that you find in social regulation, or let's say non-economic regulation, is a kind of enhanced consumer protection. Because of course you have in Europe a whole number of laws which are prohibiting unfair conduct and unfair practices by company, every sector and every size. But the EU lawmaker thought that because the telecom sector is so important and at the same time so complex for the user, it was important to add a kind of sector-specific consumer protection in telecom. And basically what this sector-specific consumer protection does is two main things. One is to provide more information to the user so they can decide with better knowledge, and also information which can be used easily. So instead of having a 20 page of term and condition, now next to those 20 pages, the telecom operator have to provide a summary in maximum 1 page with the main information. Because, you know, you know that nobody will read 20 pages of term and condition, but one page maybe the people will read. So also some comparison services should be done. So either the regulator or some third party should organize a kind of comparison services to be sure that the consumer, or to facilitate in a way the choice of consumer. But one thing is to have the information, the other thing is to act upon it. And so not only the code give more information to the user, but it also is facilitate the switching of the user, that the user can vote with their feet, and leave an operator to go to another. How they do that? By, for instance, limiting the contract duration. Sometimes you had a contract for 20 years, and so you were, 20 years was rare, but maybe 5 years. And so you could not leave during the 5 years period. This is illegal now. Or by facilitating number portability. Because of course, if the company, the operator tell you, yeah, yes, you can go to the competitor, but you lose your telephone number, the people will say, well, no, then I remain to you, because if I have to recommunicate the telephone number to everyone, that will be a little bit complicated. So, a number of provision which really aims to empower the user with better information and more possibility of switching, more possibility that you have in the traditional sectors. Again, you find the same kind of things in energies and in other network industries. And then the last, and that's the last slide, I believe, is the net neutrality provision, which is an absolutely key provision, which has been introduced in Europe in 2015. And the idea there is that a telecom player, so an internet provider, cannot discriminate the content. So if it is a content coming from Facebook, from a small player, or from another player, they all should be treated in the same way. So you cannot prioritize traffic. There are some exemptions, but basically the idea is that all bits should be treated in the same way. So because in 2015 and at the time when the net neutrality debate was discussed, one of the big concerns of the digital platform was to say that the telecom company, which has a kind of a bottleneck over the user, because if Facebook wants to reach a certain user, it needs to go through that telecom company. They were using and they would abuse their position, their bottleneck position, to ask a lot of money to some digital platform. So there was an economic argument there, and there was also a kind of a political argument or free speech argument to say that it's not up to the telecom players, which are running the infrastructure, to decide which speech goes first on the network. So there was a mix of human rights argument and economic argument, and a strange, let's say, coalition between human rights activists and some and the digital platforms to call for this net neutrality rule, which has been in European law. You had the same in the US, and then it has been reversed. So now it's a little bit, the situation is a little bit different in the US, but clearly the idea was that the telecom players cannot abuse their bottleneck position to favor one traffic over another. Well, so this is also part of a kind of additional consumer protection. If you want, you can read that in that way as well. Okay, so this is what I wanted to tell you for this part. So again, my paper tried to summarize that a little bit. It's a very descriptive and legal, so it's really tried to summarize the main provision of the code. But the code itself is relatively well structured. It's extremely long. There is nearly 200 articles, so it's an extremely long directive. But on the other hand, you find everything in one text, which has its advantage, and that's not the case in, for instance, in railways or in energy, where you have to deal with a number of different texts. The other thing I wanted to say is that also this kind of structure that I have presented to you for telecom regulation, you can apply in every network industry, you know. So, and you will see that also in the rest of the module, or you have seen that already, because I'm in the middle, I believe. But the kind of structure with entry regulation, economic regulation, universal service, and social regulation, you also find that in energy. You also find that in railways. You also find that in postal and everything. So really, I think all those European regulation which relate to network industry are structured more or less in the same way. But there are some differences, as I told you. So structural separation was imposed in energy and was not imposed in telecom. But so there has been different policy choice which have been made, but the structure is the same. And the objective is always the same, is to create more competition because it's believed that competition creates innovation and investment. And also maybe a last element, which is very common, is that the regulation, in particular the economic regulation, is there to complement antitrust, not to substitute. So it's not one or the other, it's both together, okay? And basically, regulation is there, economic regulation is there when antitrust is believed to be not effective enough. And so what is very interesting with the new, let's say, platform regulation, which have been adopted recently, in particular the Digital Market Act, is the exact same thing. We have seen that a number of antitrust cases against Google or against Facebook or against Amazon or against Apple have not been very effective. And therefore, it has been decided that those needs to be complemented with an economic regulation. So this, you know, this direction of travel of saying, okay, we use antitrust as much as we can, and then when we realize that it doesn't work or it's not effective enough, we complement it with regulation. This is a direction of travel that you have in telecom, but that you have also in other network industry, being tangible network industry like energy, or being intangible network industry like online platform. Voila, I don't know if you have some questions. So again, I'm sorry for this flow of information over the last 4 hours. But I was telling you, the important is the forest. If you want to understand the trees, go to the papers, the background reading. I don't know if you have some question or remark.
I have a quick one. I just wanted to know about BEREC. Is this like similar to ECN or something like that? They issue guidelines, but they are not like a regulatory body. They are just somewhere from the parties to meet.
Yes, a very good question. To some extent, yes, but there are some differences. So clearly, it's not a regulatory body; it's more a club. And in that sense, it's very close to the European Competition Network or to ACER in energy. You know, so it's a club of national regulatory authority which talk to each other, which exchange best practices, and which adopt guidelines to have a kind of a common interpretation of EU provision. So in that sense, yes, it's very close to the ECN, and it is not a European regulatory authority like the FCC, for instance, is in the US for the telecom sector. But there is one difference, however, is that the ECN is very much about also case allocation. You know, it's okay, we have a problem, it will be the Commission who will deal with it, or the German Competition Authority, or the so there is a case allocation role that the ECN plays that BEREC do not play. So, you know, because every telecom regulator is competent on its territory. And so if you have a problem in France, it will be the French telecom regulator which will deal with it, not another one. So you don't have an issue of case allocation that you have, but that you have in competition law. But for the rest, yes, it's the same kind of logic. Yes, and then there is also another difference, is that in the ECN, you have the Commission as the European Antitrust Authority. Okay, so in Europe, and you should never forget, you have 28, in fact, antitrust authority. You have the 27 national one plus the European one, which is the Commission. In BEREC, you only have 27 telecom regulator because the Commission is not a European telecom regulator. So the Commission is there in BEREC, but in a very different role, you know, more in a policy role than in an enforcer role. Okay. Other question or remark? No? Then Valérie, you have the last.
Yes, yes. So thank you again, Alexandre, for joining us today, for making this presentation far away from your usual office. And thank you all for joining as you are here every Friday. So I sincerely thank you for joining us because I know you can skip it. You have an exam to give soon. So thank you very much. And I will meet you again next Friday for the last lecture of Module 9. And as you know, I'm available anytime if you need to call me or send me a quick email. Thank you very much and have a good weekend to all. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
If you have additional
Thank
questions,
you.
you can always email me. Huh?
Yes. Thank you, Alex.
Bye-bye.